Today on the show, we first of all have a brand new studio, which, welcome. Tell us what you think in the comments. But we have an amazing conversation with one of our friends, Shane Simonsen. And
Dr. Shane Simonsen.
Dr. Shane Simonsen. And so basically Shane's entire worldview is that it is likely that our modern industrial system will not survive for much longer. And rather than treat that as a crisis that is imminent and that we should run screaming from, he instead leans into it and is working on developing a set of crops that could be used for highly regional agriculture in the absence of a global distribution system. And that sounds a little bit dry, but Shane he's thought about so many things about history and science and society that every action that he takes is deeply seated in theory. And so everything makes sense, and it's a reassuring perspective about what's going to happen to us as a species and what people like him who are just curious about tinkering can do to make the world a better place for whatever comes next.
And fundamentally, like, if evolution happens in stepwise transitions, what does the next step look like? Does it look like a post-apocalyptic wasteland like we see in horror movies? Or does it look like something more beautiful that comes out of some sort of ashes, right? When civilizations transition, there's often a really unfun day that has to happen. But what comes next? And what do those new structures look like? And that's something we're infinitely curious about.
You're going to love this conversation, so enjoy it. In the meantime, if you do really like it, leave a comment, tell your friends. If you've done that, join our Patreon. For just a couple of dollars a month, you can make a life-changing contribution to this project. We are currently not making a ton of money off of it, but we have big, big, big dreams.
Well, all of the money is going back into the project for sure. And we want to take this on the road. I'm going to keep saying that. We want to be able to do live interviews with guests, and we also want to just, make a stage show out of it, at least do some tours and go around to different cities, and we can really use your propulsion.
And on an even bigger scale than that, we want to reawaken the spirit of free inquiry in our society. And that sounds really nebulous and highfalutin, but in
Bring back natural philosophy.
Bring back natural philosophy. But I was talking to somebody in our Discord.
Make natural philosophy great again.
I was talking to somebody in the Discord, Z, who was pointing out that natural philosophy carries a lot of weight. It's a burdensome word that people associate with.
Stanford's going to throw it out of the dictionary.
Stanford's going to throw it out of the dictionary for sure. We're trying to start something that hasn't ever been seen before because we're powered by the internet. Like, we're powered by being able to connect people from all over the world instantaneously. And what I really want to be able to do in the long run is to have funds to be able to help people work on projects together. And so in addition to stage shows, in addition to live shows, in addition to in-person interviews, we want to be the place where people with ideas come and develop them. And in order to make that happen, we need money.
Because there's a tier of people like that when we're trying to figure out who we're going to have as guests, some people have really cool preliminary ideas, but they haven't developed them enough.
And they need a mathematician, or the mathematician needs a theoretician.
Or they just need time to work on it.
Yeah.
And so we hope that we can put together something of a scholarship program as we move forward through this, maybe as a separate compartment of what we're doing here, and start to incubate new ideas, because obviously the academic structures are limited to what they do, and they do what they do pretty well. But, there's other things that are outside of that container that need to be investigated. So we'd like to help with that.
And so join the Patreon at patreon.com/DemystifySci. And in the meantime, enjoy the conversation with Dr. Shane Simonsen.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The DemystifySci podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
All your work seems to revolve around the assumption that civilization as we know it is unsustainable to the point that it inevitably is going to disappear and something else will take its place.
Yes, and I would clarify that to industrial civilization, which is a very recent, very flash in the pan transformation of the system.
What got you thinking about that? Why are you so convinced of this? What's this? How does this play out? Before we talk about like what I really want to like spend most of our conversation exploring what comes next. But you know, why are you so convinced of this?
Yeah, and there are a lot of other people out there who have analyzed the industrial system and gone into this into a lot more detail. So yeah, I think there's a danger of like rehashing all of that because you know it's been done to death. It's out there if you want to find it.
Well, it's new to us. It's new to us. I mean, we haven't really found anybody. Most of the people who come on the show are technologically oriented. They think we're gonna basically tack our way out of whatever crisis we encounter as an industrial civilization. So this is kind of the first time that we've really investigated the alternative, which is that we don't.
So personally for me, the journey started around 2008 when I was doing a postdoc and the global financial crisis unfolded. And I was somewhat aware of the peak oil community at the time who was focusing on that particular resource as being likely to be a limiting factor in the future of industrial civilization in the near term. And as the GFC unfolded, there was a spike in oil prices. It went from, I think in the 90s, it was like $20 a barrel. And during the peak, it went up to like over $150 a barrel and caused all sorts of flow-on economic chaos. So that got me interested in studying how this, you know, giant complicated system works and all of the warning signs that are out there that it's starting to run into resource limits. And at the time, there was a very catastrophist.
Sorry, I just want to pause you real quick. Is that at the basis of your assessment? Is that the resources will not sustain the level of society that we have right now? Essentially,
yes.
Okay, just
at the time there was a very fast collapse catastrophist school who thought like we're all going back to the Stone Age like tomorrow. And there were quieter voices that got less attention saying, oh, well, if you look at history, these things generally take generations to play out. And over time, I came to fall into the second camp, that there's a lot of fat in the system that can be trimmed out. One thing that was really interesting that I learned was that the personal internal combustion engine for like gasoline fueled cars was designed because gasoline was a waste product in the early era of oil production. So the really light fractions were good for like running planes and petrochemicals. The really heavy fractions were good for heavy machinery, but there were oil refiners that were just having to pour the gasoline, the middle fractions, into rivers because nobody wanted to buy it. So they had to engineer a way for society to consume this excess.
Interesting. And that's kind of at the heart of industrial growth at some point, right? From what I understand is that you have to find a way to, in order to maximize your efficiency, you need to make sure that every part of your process is marketable, essentially.
Absolutely, yes.
And this is kind of like plays into our food supplies and everything else. Like people look at their foods and like, why do I have 100 ingredients in my peanut butter? It's like, well, somebody had to sell something to somebody, basically.
Yes, and you only have to look at. I think North Korea is a really good example about how the per person resource consumption can fall dramatically, but you still have something that a system that has some degree of industrial technology. The average person is living a pretty much medieval lifestyle, but they still maintain cohesion and a degree of technical proficiency.
What do you mean that the average person's living a medieval lifestyle?
Like they're mostly peasants, right?
Yeah, they're mostly peasants living in remote countryside.
I see.
The central authority still has access to high technology. So a prolonged intermediate phase of that nature is likely. I think that's the most likely outcome.
I want to know more about North Korea, but I want to let's put a pin in that. So I'll write it down that we can come back to it.
Again, all of this resource stuff is other people have done it better. And
who are some of your favorite authors on that subject?
Oh, see, at the time, probably the Post Carbon Institute would be a good place. what was they did a really good animated series. There's No Tomorrow or something. Yeah, again, it's one of these amazing things that a group of very intelligent, very interested people put together, and it got almost no attention.
Because I feel like every time I turn on YouTube, there's like a new catastrophism plan for what's, maybe it's just my YouTube channel for a while there.
Yeah, I think whenever somebody talks about what the algorithm feeds them, I'm always like, are you telling on yourself?
It hasn't been that way in a while. I feel like there was some period of time where we were going down the whole 9/11 truther and all this stuff, and we were just getting every conspiracy theory in the world.
And I mean, catastrophe sells, right? I think that something that you said about that you encountered a lot of voices that were saying that it was imminent, while there were other people in the background who were saying that, well, it's probably going to take a while. The story of it's going to take a while is a lot less sexy, because that means that maybe you can work on it, maybe you can do something about it, maybe you can put in plans, maybe it's not going to be devastating, maybe you won't be able to go out in a blaze of glory over the course of your own lifetime, and instead you'll have to just be part of this weird human project that we're all part of. And that's
Absolutely,
just... I think that people have been promising the end of the world since there was the conception of a world. Like, I think that's just baked in.
It's baked in.
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen it happen too, right? Like, especially places like Europe or Mediterranean or Mesoamerica, right? The Aztecs came up having seen the Teotihuacanis disappear, and they saw the ghosts of those civilizations. And I guess, like, out here in America, we don't have ruins of giant cities to look back upon in the same way.
Well, this brings up an interesting post I did a while ago. It's titled "The Diminishing Returns on Collapse." So I looked at mass extinctions through the history of the planet, and if you actually look, the recovery happens faster each time. So the biosphere is getting better at enduring, like, mass extinction events. And likewise, if you look at civilizations and their collapses after they reach peaks of complexity, we're learning ways of bouncing back faster. And that kind of makes sense. Like, the more often you practice doing something, the better. The flip side of that as well is, I think I did a post against permanence. So we have this drive that we want stability, and we imagine this utopia where everything's perfect forever. I would actually argue that isn't the optimum solution in complex systems, that a system of fluctuating levels of complexity actually allows the system to tap into new possibilities. Whereas if you achieve this perfect utopia and it never changes, what you're actually doing is setting yourself up for a brittle system that when it does collapse, it will be much more devastating.
I think that this is Taleb's anti-fragile idea, right?
Yes, yeah.
Where in essence, it's that what you want to be some sort of system that is stronger after a fracture or stronger after some kind of destabilization, as opposed to being something that just rattles itself apart. And I think that that's a really valuable idea, because you hear people talk about utopia as if there will come a point where we will just hit this coasting point where we won't have to worry about anything. It'll be post-scarcity. And it just doesn't seem realistic to me.
It's like they're almost, it's like if things actually change for the better by breaking down first, because they get so corrupt and so disgusting and wasteful and inefficient and ineffective, like if a system of government is just not able to do what it's supposed to do anymore, then it makes sense that there'd be like a step function for this, as opposed to some just like, well, we'll just keep doing what we're doing and get better at it, and hopefully, we'll hit utopia at some point. It's been really interesting. We just have started watching this Adam Curtis series that's on YouTube. I forgot the name of it. I was trying to tell Trauma Zone. Yeah, I was trying to tell my students this morning. Have you seen it?
I've seen a lot of Adam Curtis's stuff, and I find
he's
it
so
very
good.
Interesting.
Yeah. I mean, he's weird. It's definitely weird. His style is super weird. But watching a civilization, or at least, I think it's fair to call the Russians a civilization. Like, watching them shake apart in real time and seeing that documented over 10 years is really, it's really in some sense terrifying, but it's also optimistic because they did shake free this really tyrannical structure, albeit they're stuck with a global system and a global context that's really, led them into the same kind of problems that the rest of us are facing at this point. But it's there's amongst all of the chaos and misery, I think there is a little bit of hope that, people do matter at the end of the day. And if there's 100,000 people in front of the Kremlin, there's nothing that those bureaucrats can do to deny them, the democracy that they're demanding.
And I mean, I think that this comes back to what you were saying, that there's a lot of fat to be trimmed. Like, we live comfortably and we live wastefully. And there's a long way down to the bottom of the barrel, so to speak. And so to link this back to where you were before, it seems like what you were saying is that you started looking into these industrial systems and realizing that the people who were not necessarily bullish on collapse, but were suggesting that it was going to take a while, were probably right because of how much extra we still had.
Yes, yeah. And particularly in research science, I looked at the amount of consumables that are used routinely now that come from the other side of the world, at the very top of the most complicated supply chains that you can imagine. And from the people I've kept in touch in the lab, it's like you more frequently get disruptions now where one ingredient in your magic solution that you use disappears and you're just sitting around 6 months waiting for it to appear again. So that, and apart from the fact I wasn't really enjoying academia, but that's a whole other issue that I'm sure we could commiserate on for quite some time.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm still hanging on a tiny bit.
Yeah, that's true.
I was at the university this morning.
But so where did this lead you? So you look at the system and you're like, it's probably not going to fall apart today. But you're in this academic job at the time that you're looking into it.
I saw it as a future of the trend of crapification continuing, of the people in the system hanging on by their fingernails ever harder to make a decent life. And coupling that with not enjoying the research climate. I went into research science quite happy with the idea of being poor for the rest of my life, but I had the naive assumption that that would come with a degree of stability. So, and that was the one thing that pushed me out, the idea of swinging from grant to grant and never knowing when the chain was going to be broken and being spat out the other system. And that coupled with the lack of curiosity that I saw in research, I was like, I can do more fun things on my own. So I started an experimental farm instead.
Yeah. It's interesting how when you're first starting out down that road, you think, oh, well, I can just ask for money to do things that are cool. Like I can ask for money to study things for which I have curiosity for. And then you kind of slowly realize that there's money set aside for specific endeavors, essentially. And if you don't fit into one of those specific endeavors, then you're, like you said, you're not really going to have any security whatsoever. And it's it's usually coloring within the lines is the way I like to talk about it. Like a field is prescribed, and then people spend as long as possible drawing out, adding little incremental pieces to inside that field, right? Because venturing outside of that has a much higher risk. So if you're it's harder to justify it, right? Like literally in the short term. You know, one of the safest things you can do that we see a lot, at least in this country, we have these massive research institutions, right? And one of the first labs I worked in was like this mega lab, right? It was like, there's technically one dude at the top, but he's like not really there ever. He's off doing whatever. And then there's like a whole sea of lieutenants, scientists under him. And then they each have a sea of postdocs. The sea of postdocs have seas of grad students. Like,
you said that there was like more than 100 people in the lab, weren't there?
I don't want to quote. I think so. I think it was on that order, and I think this puts you in this really, really forces you into that, coloring within the lines thing, because your job now is like a piece of this enormous machinery. Like the chances that you're going to be steering the curiosity needle is just out of the question until honestly, probably at any level in that chain, because the guy at the top his peers are people with other mega labs. And so that's where the decision making is happening. Of course, they're all in bed with pharma, and it's just this nightmare. So
did you know with Nobel Prize winning research, the vast majority of it was done before the person was 30?
That's interesting.
And the first time that people get their own grant now, they're usually in their mid-40s. So this idea that you have fluid intelligence when you're younger, and for whatever reason, you're more likely to take risks. And as you get older, you end up with more crystalline intelligence, and that coloring within the line seems much more appealing on a psychological level.
Well, you have much more at stake. Like when you're older, something that was really amazing to me. So to bring it back to Trauma Zone, we're watching this movie where people are out in the streets protesting. And it seems impossible to imagine that level of political action in the population at this point. And I think it has to do with the fact that people have debt now. Like these people didn't have debt. They didn't have a job that if they lost, they would still owe $300,000 on a mortgage and they would lose their house, their car, their computer, everything, right? So when the state is providing for you and you don't have to worry about what's going to happen if you try to change something, then it's very, very different versus the condition when you recognize that you have bills to pay and making movements that are perhaps outside the lines, as you say. You can't possibly do it. There's too much at stake, whether it's your family,
like
whether
you
it's
need
your
that global
postdocs.
financial structure is essentially what you're saying. Like the modern citizen is dependent upon that.
Yeah, but I'm bringing it back to science and like why, as you get older, you tend to become more conservative in terms of the movements that you make and the sort of decisions that you make. And I'm sure that there's some biological basis for the way that intelligence changes, but there's also a huge social component to it because you have so much more that you're responsible for that if you make a move and it's wrong or it takes you 15 years to get to the point where you're actually accomplishing something, you're 40. You're not at the beginning of your career anymore. The time scales don't match. You're like, I'm gonna be old before I figure it out.
Yeah, it doesn't fit in a human lifetime.
Yeah, exactly.
I would use an ecological analogy. So fossil fuels hitting the world economy was kind of like a rare desert rainfall event where suddenly there's all these extra resources available and all these seeds that could never germinate before suddenly had a chance to get growing. But over time, as that resource base has become more constrained, you're left with pre-established plants and trees that can suck the last bit of moisture from the soil and leave none of it for little tiny seeds to germinate. So the whole system is kind of crystallizing into these dominant networked players that can monopolize the remaining resources and make it pretty much impossible for things at the margin for new things to come into existence. And looking at how punctuated equilibrium and disasters in ecosystems work, I think this is a broader pattern that living complex systems optimize, but in a really short visioned kind of way. And it ends up with a good enough solution that dominates the available resources, and then it stagnates until another disaster hits the system.
And so there is one option where the system just kind of stays in place, right?
Unless you get some external action that pushes it into a new disaster and a new cycle of renewal.
Right, exactly. But I mean, I'm thinking of, we were researching a piece about palm oil plantations in the tropics, and I came across the factoid that there was an area in Borneo, which of course I can't remember the name of the forest, but they were suggesting that the forest had been continuously rainforest for 40 million years. And so to me, that suggests that you can have an environment where you have a stable position, where you have enough of your necessary resources and the distribution of those resources through the ecological system. Even though you have these massive trees that are taking the resources, there's still enough for there to be massive biodiversity and vibrancy. But you don't seem to think that about the current system.
Nothing's absolute, but it definitely makes it more difficult for new experiments to be tried when you have a good enough solution that is already doing the job. And I would relate this back to biology as well. So there's an optimum mutation rate. Like complex organisms seem to allow a certain background mutation rate. And if it's too high, you risk everything like falling apart into chaos. And if it's too low, you miss out on new opportunities and you risk like diseases, pathogens that can reproduce more quickly catching up on you. I would think about it that way as well, that systems have they're trying to fine-tune the rate at which they allow change to happen, and that life itself is getting better at doing that over time. That previous disasters tended to end with a more brittle system and a more impactful destructive event, restarting the cycle.
Yeah, so take us back to society. How is this playing out right now? Like we looked at academia, right? And there's certainly some troubles that we're all, intimately aware of. Are those same sort of okay? I hate to do two-part questions, but I got to. So, like, what other regions is this playing out at? And then maybe if you can comment on the fact that it seems like things have to be really bad before they fall apart. Like, if you look at Soviet Russia, things are really bad. Like the food supplies are getting jacked up. People are getting
nobody's getting paid. Everybody's getting paid with the goods of the factories that they produce, and they're showing up to the train station trying to hawk like crystal vases to the people that show up on the train. Like my aunt lived through it, and her husband was a welder who the factory shut down, and she ended up selling like those like Ushanka hats.
The furry hats.
Yeah, the ear hats.
I want one. Really
she was getting furs from somebody and sewing them and selling them on the street corner in Siberia in the middle of winter.
And everybody's doing this. Like everybody is just selling whatever they can get from the factories they work at. It's just it's just chaos. And it's like, do you see something like, is our Western civilization going to come to that point before we snap and and rebuild something that's not as broken?
So the person I would defer to on this would be Dmitry Orlov. So he wrote a book comparing. So he is a Russian citizen who grew up in the Soviet Union and was living in America and visiting it periodically during their collapse of that structure. And he compared the social and economic structures in the US to what was present in the Soviet era. And predicts that the US will go through a much more damaging collapse at some point in the future, and it already seems to be going through it. And I think his primary model is that there's levels which society can collapse. So economic systems tend to break down first because they're the most abstracted. Financial, then economic, then political, and then you start getting into social collapse where like people start turning on each other. And he thought that the Soviet Union got like partway through just starting on the edge of the social collapse, but it maintained a relative degree of social cohesion that the United States may not manage to maintain if it goes through a similar restructuring.
Well, the Soviet Union had the ability to sort of be absorbed by the Western civilization as a whole, right? So it was kind of subsumed as opposed to just disintegrating and forming some brand new idea or something like that.
There was an alternative available. Is that kind of what you mean? Where it's like if the Soviet system collapses,
sorry.
No, go ahead.
The other person I would refer to again is Adam Curtis. So did you see All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace?
Mm-hmm.
So the utopian project in the USSR was to set up an economic system that monitored everything, made decisions centrally using like these complicated mathematics and algorithms, and then everything would work perfectly. And in practice, the system was so chaotic that that attempt at controlling it caused more harm than good. And I wonder, my suspicion is that something similar will happen in the Western financial systems because the way they're structured is predicated on year-to-year growth, which for most of human civilization hasn't been the norm. It's only been since we hit this vein of fossil fuels that turbocharged all of our economic activity that the financial systems reorganize themselves around that year-to-year growth, that expectation. And by many measures, that growth isn't happening anymore. And the financial system is trying to continue like creating all of these imaginary financial instruments to make it look like it's growing, to make the numbers add up. But yeah, that control system doesn't match the physical reality anymore.
And what's moreover, it's that it's not just that they're obsessed with growth. It's literally the only metric that they have, right? So, if you're a corp, people always are like, well, there's probably some really nice people who are CEOs of these transnational corporations. Like, yeah, probably. And then they probably get fired as soon as they don't make a decision, which leads to growth, right? Because that's the bottom line at every single decision right now. And it's not... Go ahead.
The rules of the game dictate the decisions that the players make. So we're locked into this system, and there doesn't seem to be any easy way for a society to change those rules. I mean, the last time we did it was like World War I and World War II. A lot of that was related to financial imbalances. Even the British invading China, when they got their navy up and running, part of that was based on financial imbalances, because the British were importing all of these things from East Asia, all these luxury goods, and all of the silver was ending up in China and distorting their financial system. So they were kind of driven to that response. Not because they were like evil people who wanted to conquer. They'd set up a system where the calculations that they used to manage it were forcing them in a particular direction.
And I think that is a really important piece, that the calculations that have been set up force you in a certain direction. And that's the case with the environment always. Like, that's the central tenet of biological systems, is that your environment is going to shape the niche, and you're going to respond to the niche if you're going to survive. And so the niche change that seems apparent is that stability is on the downswing and variability is on the upswing when we're talking about weather events, when we're talking about agricultural seasons. And so a lot of your work seems like it's focused around this question of, okay, so if the environmental ecological niche is going to change all over the world, right? It's not going to be a local thing that just happens in Australia. It's not going to be a thing that just happens in Africa. It's going to be a thing that happens all over the world. And we have these very entrenched, crystallized systems that are going to slowly become less and less effective. What do we do to fix that?
Yeah, let's just assume that trend continues.
Yeah.
Well, I don't even want to... Wait, can we hold on, though, before we figure out what we're going to do to fix it? Because there's that inevitably... like, things have to get really bad first, right? That was kind of the second part of my question. It's like, they can't just be kind of crummy. Like, you can't just be like, academia sucks. It's slow and inefficient, and growth as essential value system for our civilization. Now that's kind of inhumane. But it has to get to the point where all us lazy people are actually out in the streets, right, in front of the White House or whatever what has you. So, what does that take?
So again, I would use an analogy from biology. So when systems start reaching a level of stress, it often induces plants to produce more seeds, or microorganisms will turn into a spore form that is preparing to create something that can come through the difficult phase and then grow again when conditions are better on the other side. So the project that I'm doing with this experimental farming, I'm not trying to grow vegetables for the local neighbors and like make a pittance, like ruining my body out in the sun. I'm trying to develop systems that have the potential to endure when there are no inputs available. So I've gone through a process of gathering all of the genetic resources that I can, all the different crops and sub-varieties, putting them through trials where they get no irrigation, they get no external fertility brought in. I'm not mulching them. I'm doing minimal weed control, no pest control, and seeing if I can actually produce a product that has enough return on investment that it could support some kind of moderately complex society on the other side. So a really useful concept is energy return on energy investment, assuming that energy is the limiting thing in your system. So fossil fuels, you can spend 1 unit of oil in the early days of the oil industry and get 100 units of oil back in a relatively short period of time. That's dropped to about 10 barrels back. So we've used up the really good resources first, and we're gradually scraping the bottom of the barrel. And at some point, there will be oil in the ground, but it will be so energetically expensive to get that it's no longer an energy source. A simpler analogy would be, say you're walking an endless marathon, and every so often there's a food station where you can like grab an apple at each station. At some point, if those stations get further and further apart, you're going to be starving as you move to the next one. You're actually better off to stop moving. You'll starve slower. So with my systems, I'm trying to develop staple crops where if I spend 1 day worth of labor tending that crop, I will get 2 or 3 or 4 days worth of food calories back. And all subsistence systems have this basic metric that you need to have a minimum level of energetic profit to maintain the complexity of your society, because you need that spare energy to do everything else. And if you look at the really simple early horticulture type systems, they're usually based on tubers, starchy tubers, and they're in the consistently wet zones of the world. They will often have an energy return on energy investment for their crops of about 5 to 1. And that allows you to maintain really small villages, but nothing more, particularly because those crops are difficult to transport and store over long distances.
So you're kind of looking at one sector of this. You're like, the resources are going to run thin. And we haven't really talked about industrial agriculture yet, but I assume you're imagining that part of the reason they run thin is that system of generating food fails.
Yes. One or more of the inputs become limiting. And we're already seeing that, like in Europe, the natural gas based ammonia plants for fertilizer have shut down because they can't get that resource from Russia anymore because of the conflict.
So your idea isn't that everybody's going to grow their own food, is it? It's
absolutely not. Okay. Absolutely not. I think for the majority of the population, it makes more sense to learn to live more efficiently within the industrial system. And it's probably best left to weirdos like me who actually like being out there playing around with experimental crops and taking years to get anywhere. If you do want to grow your own food, growing vegetables makes more sense. Using irrigation water to get a yield makes more sense. But in the long run, we're talking multiple generations. We're going to have to find a way back to systems that can support themselves.
So the key difference is that by those systems falling apart, we have the opportunity to build them back with the lessons that we've learned from the previous collapse.
Yeah. And I mean, we sustained 600 million people for thousands of years using simple agriculture. And only recently, with adding industrial inputs into those systems, we've managed to boost to like 8 billion people, like a 10-fold increase in population. The chances of that population being sustained after industrial agriculture runs out of the key inputs. And it doesn't have to be oil. Like, we're mining phosphorus from a very small number of high quality resources around the world, and they're quite limited. Potassium, I think, has limited resources as well, maybe not quite as bad. And once those geological resources are gone, there isn't any simple way to get them back in that concentrated high quality form.
Is it like a thing where people are just like, damn, food costs a lot. Like, being alive costs a lot. I'm not going to have as many kids as maybe my parents would have. And then eventually you get to a point where, it's just a smaller world, basically.
Yeah, well, we're already on track for a demographic collapse of a sort in many regions in the world. And it seems to be a sensible response to increasing resource stress on an individual level. Even in the developing world, the trends are turning around quite rapidly. And I ran this thought experiment recently. So at the moment, we have a 2% birth rate globally and a 1% death rate. So if you knew 100 people, you would have 2 babies born during a year and 1 funeral, and that's normal. But that gives you a net 1% growth rate, which means every 70 years, the global population doubles. And if you keep doing that, 70 years after 70 years, you very quickly run into one resource limitation or another. At some point, just the heat coming from our bodies would cook the planet, if you can theoretically imagine trillions of us packed in battery heads. But with that same thought experiment, you can flip it around. that now you've got 2 deaths per 100 people and 1 birth. And now you're halving the population every 70 years until you come back into balance with the resources available. So for a person living their life, going from 2 births and 1 death to 2 deaths and 1 birth, that's not a disaster. That's not bodies piled up in the street. It does cause various demographic, economic, and infrastructure issues that have to be negotiated. But again, like with catastrophism, it's very appealing for people to imagine things all falling apart instantly within a short enough period to catch their imagination. And I think the media and fiction, the way it has to compete for people's attention, has some.
Well, it's got to appeal to the individual, right? That's how our own lives are. Like, events happen within a short period of time, and so
yes,
it makes sense that the way that we would conceive of meta stories like this, because intergenerational stories are epics, right? It's like, honestly, man, I love the kind of movies that are like epics where they occur over lots of different lifetimes, and you're like bouncing around in time. There's not that many of them, though. I tried to get to the bottom of these because I think that tells the kind of story that we really need to be aware of, because those are the ones that are really shaping our destinies, are these intergenerational stories,
And those kind of stories give you a perspective on what you can achieve in one lifetime. So my aims with this project is to gather the resources while it's easy to search on the internet and get letters from all over the world, and go through those difficult early stages when I'm not relying on the crop to keep me alive. Like, if it takes me 5 years to reach a reasonable energy return on energy investment, so be it. I can just rely on the industrial system to keep me alive. And then once I've got those crops, sharing them with everyone around the world who could potentially use them in their local ecosystems. And we have a really limited opportunity to do that. Like, already they're going
to be worth a lot too, man. I'm about sharing them. I mean, that's I'm sorry, but
I've ever heard you say.
I'm not trying to make a lot of money out of it.
Yeah, you won't be able to help it at that point, man. People will be trading you their
Look, Jonas Salk didn't make any money off the polio vaccine. Like, there's the guy who invented insulin sold the patent for $1 because he believed that it was necessary. Like, history is littered with figures that do good solely for the sake of doing good.
That's why there's 2 of us,
Exactly. I'm like, But something that I'm thinking about as we're talking about this is that the systems that we have in place right now they seem like they're optimized to run with lots of people. And so the fear that in a generation we could have the population, which, based off of what I've seen, the birth rates are lower than, or the population increase is slower than we think it is, because places like China are maybe not reporting accurate numbers. They might actively be going through demographic collapse. I personally think that there's some widespread environmental pollutant that seems to be lowering reproductive rates faster than just the sort of the crowdedness
Social
of cities.
Crush.
Yeah, just because.
Have you heard the theory of a genomic meltdown?
No.
This is apparently it happened.
Meltdown. I
love the name. So if you have a complex organism and it has a relatively low lifetime birth rate, so it only has like 5 children, those organisms rely on purifying selection so that the 4 of its offspring that die are more likely to be the ones that have low-level mutations that are deleterious. So to maintain particularly the reproductive health of that species, you need that constant purifying selection. So humans are already a really, really inbred species. Like, we went through an incredible genetic bottleneck, even allowing for all the diversity in Africa. We're very, very inbred. And our natural fertility rates are already really low. Like, I think it normally takes us like 8 tries to conceive. That's unheard of in any other mammals that aren't like in endangered species programs where their surface antigens have become too narrow. So if you take a species and you allow it to just expand and expand and expand in population because of the wonders of modern medicine, And instead of having 10 children and most of them don't make it to reproductive age, you only have 1 or 2 children and you throw every possible medicine at them to keep them alive, you no longer have that purifying selection. And I think I've seen models that it would take like another 10 generations of that dynamic with humans, and you end up with so many low-level mutations that the fertility rate just crashes. And
oh man, that's a really interesting theory for because certain cancers are on the rise too. It's interesting to think that they could just be a genomic crisis as opposed to a toxin in the environment.
That is true. I mean, I kind of see it as playing out in context of transhumanism, where, you know, the Kurzweilians who are chasing the singularity are basically attempting to escape death. And there was
This is how you end up in that future where it's just like a brain. And who was that guy in the Ninja Turtles crying? Like the brain inside of this robot suit, you know?
I don't think it's going to the brain in the robot suit. There's a guy.
That's sort of the wet dream of the.
I don't think so. Because there was this article that came out just a couple of days ago. I think it was New York Times or New Yorker. And there's this guy named, oh God, I'm so bad with the names. I think it's like Brian Johnson or something.
Not as bad as me.
And he has devoted himself, he's spending $2 million a year with the goal, he's 45, with the goal of regenerating his body to the biological age of 18. And, I mean, he looks a little reptilian. But but I'm like,
I knew the reptilians would make an appearance on this show.
Well, no, I mean, like, I'm not saying this in like the David Icke way. I'm saying in the way of like the dude doesn't get a lot of sun and he's like kind of scaly looking. But I think that is a huge component of this, which is that we have increases in automation, we have increases in AI. At the same time, we have people that are fantastically rich, and medicine is capable of doing exactly what you're saying, which is that it can keep somebody alive, even if their genome starts to break down. And so, aren't we headed towards
We're such fragile animals.
We
like,
are.
You look at us compared to any other animal, and it's just like, oh no, like.
But the future of nanotech and the future of biotech is that you will be able to repair those breaks as they happen, and so the aim is to become interdependent with our medicine out in front of it so that we're being repaired as we're aging. And certainly that's not going to be everybody. That's going to be some select Hyperborean few that get to occupy, you know, the paradisical earth while everybody else dies of generally accumulating mutations.
That sounds like your sci-fi book, man.
Until their bitcoins drop to zero value and then they're destitute and they can't afford all the complex treatments.
But that's an interesting point. But it seems like all countries are shifting towards this digital currency, and so it's going to be that like the U.S. dollar is maybe a digital currency. Like I go to this really dystopian place every few weeks to return cans and bottles, and you walk in and it looks like something out of Blade Runner. It's you know, the room is ringed with these machines that have a mouth, and then you put bottles into it and it like spins them, scans the barcode and tells you like if it'll take it or not. And there's always just like all of this, the room is filled with kind of like destitute, shuffly
smells
people.
Like old beer. It's like the beeping of the machines, the crunching of the machines. And
it looks like something out of a sci-fi movie, but that vision of the future seems here and present, and the water in which we swim and the people that are doing all right are nowhere near that space, and they never will be near that space. Oh, the reason I started telling the story is because the machine at the end gives you cash. And it's such a weird feeling to get the paper money.
From a robot.
Like the robot feeds you these little pieces of paper and you look at it and you're like, God, this is such ancient technology.
It's like one step above giving you parsnips, like you're a medieval peasant.
Yeah, and you just, you tuck your little vouchers away and you walk away. But it's, I really, just based off of my experience, money is in big cities like New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, you never walk into a place that's cash only. And maybe 10 years ago you did, especially in New York, because I think a lot of places operated under the table. But the idea of everybody being part of the extra financial system when they're operating digitally, I don't think that's the future. I think that it's going to be that the people who are the oligarchs and the technocrats will own the financial system of the governments themselves.
I definitely see that as the short-term future as well, that the system will consolidate for reasons of efficiency and coordination and control. It's kind of like in the last days of the dinosaurs, they got bigger and bigger because they were more energy efficient in that form, but it made it more and more difficult for them to raise their offspring. So there's like a trade-off there. And when the disaster came, it was the largest species that were unable to adapt to it. And I think something similar is playing out here, that we're in a system that's going through creeping stresses that favor bigger, more complicated organizations. But in the long run, there will be a shock and those systems will be unable to adapt fast enough, whereas the small, decentralized, less complex arrangements are more likely to come out the other end of that final blow.
So do you imagine a sort of like hyper-regionalism, or how does...
Oh, definitely. Particularly, like I'm in Australia, and we're at the end of very long supply lines. And I kind of see Australia as being like Britain for the Romans. It was their most far-flung conquest. And it very quickly reached a point where it wasn't worth maintaining it. Like they just left when the sums didn't add up. A very similar thing happened with the British Empire when it disintegrated. They sat down and they looked at the books and they're like, this particular colony is a sink for funds. There's nothing left for us to extract.
Weren't they like sending the prisoners out to? Isn't Australia just like, aren't you guys like a bunch of hardened criminals basically?
That was in the very, very early days. The first 100 years of us being a colony, we were a net food importer. So Britain would send us like cheap flour and sugar to keep us alive, and we would dig up gold. We'd let sheep eat our entire landscape, and we'd ship the gold and the wool and the timber back to the UK. And it was only when industrialization happened that our very moody continent became viable for large-scale agriculture. It's probably one of the reasons that complex agriculture didn't appear spontaneously here, though there's arguments about some forms of early agriculture.
I still remember when I was a kid, my mom subscribed me to National Geographic Kids, and there was an article about an opal mining town in the bush in Australia where they lived underground.
Yeah.
Because it was too hot for them to live above ground. And I just remember reading that and just not knowing how to fit it into my worldview. You know, like in the suburbs in America, like, you know, there's these kids in their subterranean bedrooms. Their parents are like digging shiny rocks out of the ground. I'm like, that is not of this world.
We should pray for them. That's what I was told. That's what I was told growing up. Just pray for them.
I mean, but it is true that Australia seems to operate on a scale that is not the scale of the rest of the world.
I think a lot of that actually comes from, like, you want to talk about disasters and collapses. My theory is that the collapses that really matter happened tens of thousands of years ago when modern humans managed to participate in the extinction of most of the keystone megafauna around the world. And Australia went through that the most severely. Like we've had nothing bigger than a kangaroo for the last 20,000 years, whereas before that we had things almost the size of elephants. And we had forests that grew all the way into the top half of our continent that helped draw the monsoon rains reliably into that region. And the megafauna probably managed the vegetation in a way that stopped it catching fire. And yeah, we basically had a collapsed ecosystem, like thoroughly collapsed on like every possible level of ecosystem function.
That's always interesting.
Tens of thousands of years.
I heard that Australia is a good counterexample to the megafauna being hunted off by humans, because the megafauna persisted. Like the humans had lived in I think it was a bigger continent than it included part of Indonesia and stuff, right? Maybe, I don't know how many millions of years ago this was, but there was some sort of hominids there for a long time that were coexisting with the megafauna. Whereas it's always said, you know, as soon as the hominids showed up here, in the Americas, that was pretty much it. They just hunted them to death, but it doesn't seem to coincide with what happened in Australia.
I've seen a more nuanced treatment of the situation in Australia. And again, this is a bit non-politically correct, so it doesn't often get discussed. So I'm just reporting what I've seen other people say, but I think it fits the patterns. So the theory is that about 60,000 years ago, the first wave of humans arrived in Australia. And these tended to be coastal people with relatively limited hunting capacity. So they had more capacity to coexist with the megafauna. There was another wave of... there was the descendants of those people were driven into Tasmania before the sea levels rose and became a fairly distinct lineage of people. And they were driven to pretty much extinction. There's very little continuous culture left with those, so it's difficult to do research on those. But that people also ended up in the highlands of Papua New Guinea as a fairly distinct lineage from the people who came later, who lived in the lowlands. So in Australia, between 20 and 30,000 years ago, a second wave of people arrived that had much more advanced hunting technology. And that seems to be when the megafauna extinctions happened, and they lived more successfully in the interior of the continent. But even more recently, about 5,000 years ago, another group of people arrived that brought the dingo. And nobody questions that the dingoes only arrived 5,000 years ago. Before then, the Tasmanian tiger and Thylaca leo and Tasmanian devil all lived on the mainland as predators, and they were all wiped out within a short order by this introduction of a new generalist predator that cooperated with humans.
Where did the dingo come from?
From Southeast Asia.
Interesting. I didn't know they
Are
had
there still dingoes
out
in Southeast Asia?
There are highland singing dogs in Papua New Guinea that are closely related to our dingoes.
The musical really cousins of the aggressive dingo.
So they're both really early offshoots from the domestic dog line.
Interesting.
Man, there's something else I wanted to ask you about with regard to this whole collapse thing, which is the AI job. I know this is a little bit of a tangent, but the AI and jobs thing. This is something we talk about all the time, so I wanted to get like a third take on this. But as we engineer solutions to our technical problems, because that's inevitably what everybody's trying to do right now, especially the tech-driven economy. Well, it seems like they've recently found a way to find robots that can do a lot of their own work for them, and this is potentially going to play out, especially with the new chatbots, in a way that is going to swamp that economy in a way that nothing ever has before. But I think it plays into this bigger picture, is what I'm trying to get at, that jobs are the essential way that consumers get the money to buy the products that keeps the wheel turning. So another possibility that I was thinking, that we discuss all the time, that could accelerate this moment is that we don't have a way to deal with the fact that consumers don't have the money to buy the products anymore, which is simply that they've engineered themselves out of having jobs. And it's already kind of, maybe the tip of the iceberg is showing with Google's layoffs and Facebook's layoffs, and who knows what these chatbots are capable of.
I mean, the model that I use is that in the past, if you, for example, my brother linked me the other day to a bunch of flyers that live musicians had made to protest the soundtracks in movies. Because they're like, you don't want a robot playing your music for you. Like, this is terrible. And so they had this like demonic robot playing the cello or something. But what happened is that those people were absorbed somewhere else into the economy because the economy needed them for something.
Is this back from the 30s or something?
Yeah.
I see. Yeah, because they used to have live bands playing in the movies.
Yeah, exactly. So you'd have an orchestra that was in the movie theater that did the soundtrack for the film. I didn't realize that wasn't common knowledge. Thank you.
No, I was imagining people getting pissed now because they're like, damn it, like
they're getting pissed now because the AI can generate art, and now the idea that you would hire an artist to do your art isn't
we went
necessary.
through this once already in the taxi.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But you had an economy that needed workers, and if you have an economy where you have programs that can take over most of the function of your workers, and so you downsize where instead of needing 1,000 workers, now you need 50 to do the same amount of work, what happens?
Yeah, what happens
It's
to
like
all
that's
those consumers? What happens
Well,
when
yeah.
Society went through a similar process during the industrialization of agriculture. All of the peasants that were the bulk of the population were driven out of the countryside and just forced into the cities. And in some ways, that made the development of factories possible because there was a ready workforce desperate to survive.
But my point is, I'm like, if you have automated agriculture, you have automated factories, everything is automated. You don't need the construction is automated, the driving is automated, the bureaucracy is automated. You don't. Where do the people like? You're going to push them to space? Like, where do people go if there's not an
what's
industry
the
that's
utility?
hungry for them?
Yeah,
Because
the utility.
when the people get pushed out of the countryside, they're being pushed because industrialization is already happening, and so there is a need.
There's a new place for them. It's
There's a
kind of
new
like
place for them already.
Russia into the West or something
Yeah,
like that.
yeah. And I'm like, in a world where there's not really a frontier, there's no planetary frontier anymore, what happens?
Yeah, what happens? to all
Maybe
this
the only thing left to do is to form lifeboats and wait for the system to collapse. That might explain my motivation. I basically saw that as the only place to put my energies at this time in history.
Well, I think it does point to the buildup of a dissatisfied population at some point if it's not remedied, right? Because obviously people are, I don't want to use the word addiction, but people like to buy stuff, right? The people who have
Enthusiasts, I believe, is the
enthusiast
Stanford
is
suggestion.
Stanford just released a list of
They retracted it. They retracted
oh,
it.
they damn it! It's so funny. They said, we shouldn't use the word addict anymore. We should call them enthusiasts or devotees.
Yeah.
But so people are kind of addicted to this lifestyle to some extent. They like their. I don't think that's actually a fair word, but
It feels good to be able to go out and to buy stuff. Like, I'm not a materialistic person, and yet I will go to the grocery store on a regular basis. Sometimes I want to
it's
get
a dopamine hit. Come on.
yeah,
There's no way around it.
It is. And I
But-
mean, like, I don't succumb to the madness of, like, fast fashion where you have 12 seasons a year and you're constantly having to buy stuff. But I know that it is satisfying to be able to reward yourself for the work that you've done.
And you need to do that work to be able to keep that cycle going, right? Like how are you going to get the money to buy things if you don't have a job is the central crisis. And like the answer is always, well, there'll be some sort of basic income or something, right? And it's like, okay, but that's not enough. Like whatever it is, it's not enough, right? And it's certainly not enough to drive the machine into the next cycle or whatever, right? Because these companies depend on growth, right? People have to be making more money to spend more money to move the thing forward. And so
You know what? It actually reminds me of an episode of history. So 8th century China went through a golden age and a population boom, which was built on improvements in rice farming techniques, which led to its massive increase in population. But before the population increased, there was a need for labor-saving devices. So there was this scientific golden age where all of this new technology was developed because there wasn't enough of a workforce. But at some point, the population kept growing and growing until it reached a stage where it was cheaper to pay a starving peasant to do any job that you can imagine because they were just so desperate. And that completely stopped improvements in scientific development because there was no incentive to develop machines and devices and experiment with other ways of doing things. The economy got so swamped with surplus labor that everything ground to a halt. And I guess it just depends on the balance of how cheap technology can be versus how cheap labor can be. Because at the moment you've got freelancer sites like, Fiverr and all those places where people living in all over the world in places with much lower cost of living can offer to do a job for like $5 that someone in the West could never devote that amount of time to do, but it's enough for that person to live. So it's similar to that pattern that unfolded in China, but it's got differences as well too, which make it hard to predict where it's going to go.
Yeah, I wonder if this process will be forestalled by the fact that those workers, the tech workers that are being dispersed and maybe will be deeply displaced by the advances in AI, I wonder if they won't find work globally in the developing world, because a lot of countries, I'm not saying this is like going to solve the problem, but it seems like it might push it off for at least the rest of the present tech generation's careers or something like that.
I guess I just don't see it as being a tech problem. I see it like, so Shane, what you said is that what is left to do is to get into a lifeboat and wait for the wave. And on some level, I just, maybe it's just my pessimistic nature, but I really do see it as being a turnover in the way that we see society's structure, where in the past we've always seen it since the establishment of the capitalist system, that your role is to work, and your role is to work for someone else, and you will get some modicum of reward, and that reward will pay for your costs of living plus a little bit extra so that you can have some fun. And I just...
Well, if you're lucky, you can climb the ladder to the top too. That's the real carrot, right?
I mean, no.
So many people are on that trip, though.
Nobody from the bottom has really ever climbed to the top of that ladder. Do you buy that? Like, do you buy that people from the bottom ever climb to the top?
I've seen it happen in like my own...
only as well curated examples to incentivize the people at the bottom to keep dreaming, I think.
Come on, my dad had like dirt floors in his house. You know, it's like this stuff happens.
I asked him about that. They had wooden floors.
Here's an interesting countermeasure. So people say, like, a common retort for peak oil awareness is that the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. And I would say, have you seen what people build their houses out of these days? It's like vinyl cladding. It's like it's petroleum products, because that's all we've got left. Even plantation timber that has to be treated with arsenic so it doesn't rot in a few years is the other option. If you wanted to build your house with hardwood, like, you know, the peasants from centuries ago, the resource is gone. Like, you would have to be a millionaire to build a hardwood house these days. And if you wanted to build a stone house, you would have to be a billionaire, because the cost of that resource, like the amount of it that's available, the skill that is involved in creating the construction is so far beyond what an ordinary person could afford. It's like me. I've got a herd of dairy goats, and you know, a few centuries ago, that would be like a typical thing for a peasant to expect to have a few goats to produce milk for themselves. Now it's some kind of bougie, like yuppie luxury kind of thing.
I'm glad you called yourself the peasant. Somebody like complained on one of our recent videos that we used the word peasant like it's a politically incorrect word or something like that. Like, who you calling a peasant? I'm like, me, man. Yeah, all of us. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, but where does that lead you to?
Well, it's my core philosophy that systems are chaotic, and that attempts to control them inevitably fall apart. And particularly with biology, like modern biotechnology, I think is very fragile in both the methods and the end results. So a good example would be like the single gene approach to producing transgenic crops. So BT cotton that has a single bacterial toxin in it that kills insects. I think it took like 3 years and resistance appeared. And before that, there were insects that don't chew the crop. They only suck the sap. They were never a problem before, and suddenly they appeared and ravaged the crops. So I suspect that our reductionist approach to dealing with biotechnology is leading us in a dead end, and that there's many more opportunities to do biotechnology that is, I would say, agnostic is probably the best way of looking at it, that you can manipulate biology in ways that doesn't rely on knowing anything about genomes or proteins. My core argument is that the Neolithic revolution that allowed much more complex, like grain-based civilizations to rise, that was built on biotechnology. It was a few random early farmers that did the hybridization work of mixing together different wild species, And that formed the foundation that everything else was built on.
And that's because, like, just to clarify, just for people who are listening, because almost everybody hears biotechnology and they're like, oh, you mean like manipulating DNA and doing molecular work, stuff like that, right? But
and genome sequences and analyzing all of this torrent of information that we've tapped into. We don't know what to do with it. I grew up through the Human Genome Project, and there was all of these promises about, tomorrow, as soon as we've got the genome finished, we're going to have all of these cures and all of these new possibilities. We still have no idea what we're talking about. A really good example of like the complexity that we keep running into. So the model was just that the chromosomes are just these big bags of DNA that hold genes that make proteins at the end. Just recently, we figured out that when the DNA is unspooled and transcribed, it forms a specific complex three-dimensional structure that puts genes on different chromosomes that cross-regulate each other close to each other. And this is probably one of the many reasons why if you just fire a gene into a chromosome to produce a protein, most of the time it doesn't work. You still have to do phenotypic selection on those transgenic organisms to find the 1% of them that actually produce the trait that you want.
Mm-hmm. But I think it's part of this bigger obsession with manipulation at this hyper technical marketable level, right? It's like, how do you, I think I hate to bring it up again, but you always got to remember that most technologies historically have been developed just through trial and error. They're not developed by having some high level scientific understanding of the phenomena that's going on. It's like, no, we're gonna do different strings on our bow until it works good and shoots the buffalo or whatever it is.
To some degree.
And then theory comes along afterwards and retrospectively
not most of the cases.
Explains.
Right.
Yeah, where it can. It comes along retrospectively. And I realized this morning. I was thinking leading up to this. This is, I think, where part of the problem comes. So when you train to be a scientist, you spend the first 20 to 30 years of your life drowning in theory, trying to catch up with the leading edge of science. And then suddenly they say, okay, Bing, you're done. You pretty much know enough theory now. Now you're an experimentalist. And you have to spend, the majority of your time in a lab banging your head against the wall because this particular solution isn't doing what it's supposed to do. And just tinkering around until you get, 5% of your results actually do what they're supposed to do.
That's so painful.
Did you experience a similar thing? You had a kind of psychic whiplash.
Oh my gosh. Anastasia had us a real story about that.
So basically, a huge part of my project was there was this antibiotic resistance cluster of genes that was canonical except for one component.
What does that mean in non-nerd speak?
Sorry. Okay, so basically, all other bacteria that have this set of antibiotic resistance genes, they all look the same. They all have the same 5 subunits. And then in Pseudomonas, there was one extra subunit. And my boss was like, this is probably really significant. It's probably doing something. And I spent 3 years because I found that it was being modified in this time-dependent way, and I was looking at time courses of it. And this is what caused me to begin to hate biological research, is that it would be 12 to 15 hour long experiments with half-hour time points. And so that means that I'm in the lab in the middle of the night, barely awake, collecting these time points from these cultures. And after 3 years, I realized that the modification was happening in the test tube after I had taken it out of the bacteria.
Oh, no.
And it was just this moment where I was and it was crazy because I realized that it was a cleavage moment, right? Because in the evil version of me in some other multiverse was no, I'll figure out how to wrap this in a way, now that I know that it's happening in the test tube, I can control it, and so I can make it look good, and I can publish it, and then I'll be gone, and that'll be that. But I was I can't do that. And I remember going to my boss and telling him that I was no, I realized that this is happening afterwards. And there's just a really long silence where it was neither one of us, neither one of us knew what to do. And we were just well, that blows.
But how much of this happens even with people unwittingly even recognizing?
Well, yeah, because I was determined.
And how often do people paper over it, make the paper to continue,
or just move on, just move on
to another project?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so I was at the point where I was like, there's no way that I'm going to contribute to like the mess that is science by just papering over this, and I have to fix it. And so, and it ended up being so heartbreaking because I put so much time into it, and it's embarrassing when you stand in front of your colleagues and you're like, I have been talking to you about this once a month for the last 3 years, and it is not true. I'm sorry.
You'd like present it at conferences?
Yeah, I'd presented it at conferences.
Yeah, it was like...
People were super excited. I'd won awards for this work, and people, it was trash. It was literally just, it was garbage. I just like swept the table clean into the waste bin and had to start over.
And for people who are further into their career, like they've actually climbed to the next level and they're hanging on by their fingernails, they can't afford to make those admissions. Like the system is set up to punish them for being honest about dead ends because it's all about results.
I think that there's not enough of a practice of really trying to prove yourself wrong. Because I think that this caused a lot of tension between me and my boss because I was like, this feels weird. Like, this is so irreproducible. And we would sit for hours talking about what it could mean. And we would come up with other experiments and I would do them. And the data would just be kind of nonsensical. But each nonsensical set of data, we would try to epicycle it into fitting. And at some point I was like, this doesn't feel right. Like, this doesn't feel like the way, because it was such a marginal effect.
Do you know what's really interesting? Like I came through my undergrad degree with this other fellow who was just a brilliant experimentalist, and he barely scraped through doing his exams and getting his piece of paper. But once he got into the lab, there was no stopping him. He had like that instinct, that intuition, that passion. He was just like, I think he's the only person I know who's still going with a research academic career. He's like half killed himself being covered in toxic organic chemicals. He loves it. He's just unstoppable. But the system is set up to filter them out. Like they fail their first and second year exams, like absorbing all of this abstract theory. And most of them never get a chance to actually do research anymore. And then you've got the people like me who like love doing exams and like memorizing all of these facts. And then you throw us in a lab and just expect us to sink or swim. And I managed to adapt to it, but after like my honors project was a dead end and I had to start again with like half the time remaining. And I did exactly the same thing in my PhD. I did this really ambitious project, burnt myself out on it for 2 years, crashed in a heap, and then like scraped myself back together to start the whole project, like a completely different project, and get it done in half the time. Dang. And I don't think I can lose that psychology of wanting to play around with wild possibilities. And like I do that with my crops. Like I've trialed so many different crops. Most of them are complete failures, but you hone in on the ones that show that initial potential and you take them the next step and see where they go. And as a counterexample to your issue with the bacterial resistance, so the field I was doing my PhD in was a plant peptide that has broadly cytotoxic activities. It's a membrane disruptor. And the thing that we were selling this in our grants was, we could use this to like kill cancer. We could put it in other crops to protect them from pests. And I'm like, this thing like kills pretty much every living tissue that we put near it. How do we know it's not going to kill the crops that we want to transgene it into? Like there could be all of these other complex mechanisms that control that toxic activity in the host plant. So why don't we just put this purified peptide in a tissue culture of like wheat cells and see if it kills them? And then we'll know that there's no way that we could easily use this to protect crops. And my principal investigator, my professor, was just like stony silent when I suggested this in a meeting, because he has no incentive to disprove that this might one day be a useful technology that you can sell to, agrochemical companies. This one simple experiment could sink the whole territory of science that he's established as being his own speciality, that he's promising all of these amazing things will come one day. One experiment, you could say, oh no, it's not worth doing that. We have to find something else to do. That means he has to restart his whole career, which is like very, very difficult and dangerous to do. So instead, you never do that experiment. and you just keep promising and doing, coloring in the margins, experiments on the side.
It makes me think like there's some, like, in terms of after the collapse of this academic, like, failure, whenever it comes to a head, right, we're going to have to build a new academy. And it seems like there are some lessons we can learn about how to do science better in the future, particularly how to educate and build new scientists up. And like, I had a very different experience, by the way, than Anastasia. I kind of had like, in the most, I say this in the most loving way, but like a complete freak of a boss who just didn't take any of this the way that we do it in the West. And I don't know if it's because he's from Turkey or what.
I think he was just so... He was just not of this world.
Yeah, so there's a couple things that stood out, though, when you guys were talking about your experiences. And one of them was this concept of play. So my boss, when I first joined the lab, he did try me out and see if I was, like, worth having in the lab, first of all. But after that, he was like, all right, I want you to take a year and just play with this. We were looking at a structure of water, actually, and he was like, I just want you to build an instrument that can study this, essentially, and play with it, and just see what's happening, and we'll just see if there's anything interesting going on. And actually, he was like, you know what, I know there's going to be something going on interesting, because there always is. It doesn't matter. Whatever experiment you do, the results don't matter in terms of whether they say this or that. It's just, they're going to say something, and we'll chase that.
And the thing that I think made him able to do that was that his work was based around using a tool to interrogate biological systems.
Lots of different systems, too.
Yeah, so it was like the lab was doing atomic force microscopy. And so it was like, whatever you can dream of doing with an atomic force microscope, like, let's just look. Nobody's done it before.
Like, things you're not supposed to do with an atomic. It's like, you go and look at a guitar, and you're like, oh, well, you could just play the guitar. And it's like, you see some musicians, and it's like, what? That's not what you do with the guitar, But I think there's something to, he also had a great ability to assemble teams, right? So we had a guy who was that theoretician who just sat up in the office all day, just like crunching numbers and screaming and like, throwing tantrums. Really brilliant dude, though. And I'm still like in contact with him. And actually, he's one of our patrons. Shout out to Hamdi, by the way.
One of our early, I remember when he signed up, I was like, "This is stunning." I was like,
so we had the theoreticians, and then this is not my own experience, but it'd be really cool to see a part of the education that allowed students to actually do a deep dive into the deep history of science, because really learning how paradigm shifts have happened in the past is something you have no time for in grad school, like absolutely none. It's like, you're going to, like you said, you're going to learn how to do this thing here, and that's it. And it's like, to become a scientist, you really, really have to understand the way that ideas have come into being possessed by a society. Like, people, it's not just about having good ideas, right? It's also about learning how to make friends and how to do like productive networking, in a sense that you can actually, Einstein wasn't the best mathematician in the world, but he did have a friend who was, right? Yeah. And this gets lost on people. And so anyways, I just thought these are the changes that I would like to see if, the academy collapses upon itself. We'll obviously need something in its place. So
I think that all of this is very, first of all, I agree. So I think these are great changes. I think that something that really stymies the entire process is model organisms, where you look out onto the vast diversity of life forms. And when you're training to be a biologist, you have this sense that the entire world of life is an open book to you, where you're going to be able to go into the laboratory and everything is going to be open to you and you're going to study life. And then you get there, and what it turns out is that there's a model organism, and the model organism is presented to you in a context that is far outside of the context in which it appears in nature. And your experiments will work inside of this artificial context in one organism out of, I was working in bacteria, one bacteria out of 30 million species of bacteria. And
most of them unculturable.
And when you show up, they hand you a book, and the book contains a century's worth of knowledge, roughly, probably less for some, but decades worth of knowledge of how to work with the bacteria. Because the genetic techniques are very difficult, the culturing techniques are very difficult. There's you change the composition of the medium in which they grow, and they behave completely differently.
And it's not just bacteria, right? It's like cell lines, it's mouse lines, right? I remember Brett Weinstein has his whole like identity is to some extent based on this like idea that the academy is broken in this way. And one of the examples he uses is he was studying telomeres, I think, in his graduate school research, and he told this really interesting story just about how he essentially realized that the reason that these animals were so responsive to these drugs had to do with the fact that they had completely strange telomeres that didn't resemble anything that you would find in the wild, and essentially had no commensurate activity with humans. And it's like, once again, we're studying the test tube instead of trying to actually understand nature.
But my central argument, I think, is that biology is irreducibly complex, and we're trying to use the wrong tool set to approach it. The approach that yielded useful results for physics or aspects of physics and the lower levels of chemistry, we're just trying to fight the same battle again with biology, and we're getting.
Well, it's failing them too. I think, yeah, it's like, okay, so you can crush things into smaller pieces, but how does gravity work? That kind of thing.
Well, I'm suspicious of the relationship between experiment and math. So even with physics, you take something as simple as a 3-body problem and the math says, oh, well, we can't measure it or calculate in any meaningful way. So you'll just have to do an approximation anyway and just keep measuring until something runs into you.
And math can really mislead you too. I love the example of heat flow, right? The math works perfectly to describe heat flow as a fluid. And people treated it that way, and they built incredible steam engines treating it that way as this ethereal fluid. But people kind of realized, I think it was friction that pushed them over the top. It was an
inexhaustible.
Inexhaustible, that's the word. Yeah, it was an inexhaustible fluid, right? So math can tell you that something looks absolutely crazy and impossible, and you can be like, but obviously the math says there's a black hole or whatever it is. And then, somebody comes along and is like, well, actually, maybe it's like this. And the math is perfectly congruent still.
But biology is kind of resistant to math. And I think that does have to do with its irreducible complexity. Because it's very hard to come up with an equation for a life form that works.
Yeah, this irreducible complexity thing is a cool idea.
And even mathematics, you wander outside of narrowly confined situations and you run into complexity and chaos as well. It's everywhere. It seems to be the rule rather than the exception. But human minds work by compressing down information. When we make a measurement, we just ignore that there is an infinite number of decimal points and our instrument's imperfect. And when we take an average, we just throw away all of those individual details of the population. And a mind works as a filter. You look at the architecture of the neurons, all of this chaos coming in through our senses has to be cut away and cut away and cut away until there's a signal left that we can actually do something useful with. And I think science has the same basic process to it, that it's all about trying to cut out all of the chaos and complexity and give us something that we can wield semi-reliably as a tool. But that isn't the only way that you can approach things. There is also the just play and serendipity and
certainly from a technological, I want you to continue that, but certainly from a technological perspective, I feel like you're fundamentally technologically oriented with this project that you're working on, right? Mm-hmm. I'm not so sure that it plays out at the basic science level the same way. I think that people really do want to put handles on things so that they can explain nature. All right, so the fundamental project of science is to separate order, cosmos, from chaos, right? It's the separation of the cosmos from the chaos. And it's that is perhaps a Sisyphean project, but it does seem to yield results. Like we do seem to have a better understanding of certain processes. Not to say that there aren't more details to be ironed out, but we make these like we make models, right? We're like, okay, I think that the solar system is like this. And they're like, no, actually, I think it's like this. And then like, we're not quite there, but we're actually getting closer to understanding. Now we have this magical stuff called gravity that holds it all together. And so we can figure that out in like a separate project maybe or something. But we've refined the model a little bit, I guess. I don't know. I'm being an optimist.
I would pose a provocative question. So the way we think about science is very much about industrial science. Is the average person's interest and faith and belief, however you want to put it, in science, how much is that related to the material abundance that science has put into motion?
Oh, for sure. 100%. 100%.
It's basically a cargo cult for the average person. In much the same way that the Christian church probably was, that it brought a degree of order and stability and comfort to people living in pre-industrial times.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
One thing I wonder is if the resources sputter out, what would the cultural reaction to the idea of science be in the future? Even branding something as science could actually end up being toxic.
I'm really afraid of that, actually. I think the pandemic was like the worst disservice to science as an enterprise. I think of science as just an art of explanation, really. Like, how do we at least, I don't care if it's right or not necessarily. I just want to be able to communicate something that makes sense to you, and you can just sit back and be like, it's a cool idea. Or that you can be like, that's stupid. But I think that ultimately we're trying to convey explanations.
But I think that ultimately we are also trying to do something with it, because it is an industrial state-sponsored
but that's
process.
engineering. That's engineering.
Maybe so, but I think that what Shane is saying is that if you have science as the foundation from which new knowledge emerges that allows you to build something that is better and better and better, and puts you on this path where you will forever be increasing your trajectory of what better looks like. And then one fine day, everybody looks around and is like, hold on a second, things have not gotten better. They've actually gotten worse. Like, life expectancy is down, birth rates are down, resources are running out. That's a crisis of faith in a discipline that is foundational to the way that we see ourselves in the world.
Don't you think this first kind of became real during the pandemic when people are kind of let down, right? The technologists are like, oh, we'll take care of this. Just give us a year. Like, we'll fix everything. You'll have this medicine. And, the actual biologists are sitting back like, why are you saying that? Like, shut up. Like, we can't do that. Like, nobody in their right mind who studies anything approximating this thinks that you can do that. Like, respiratory viruses they're pesky. They mutate quickly. Like, and the strange thing is that I felt like it was kind of ruining the name of science in this sad way. Like, I saw so many scientists getting airtime, like, just, supporting these like party lines that made no sense at all. And it just seemed like it crushed the whole, because you're right, most people do think of science as engineering. They're all one thing, right?
I think that science is attached to policy in a way that is, it's do you know the term scientific management? So it's back in the early days of the Industrial Revolution, there was a scientific management movement, which is that someone could show up to a factory and they could measure the amount of time that it took to do each component of the work, and they could give the factory owners a bar at which all of their employees had to perform in order to be optimally effective. And
it's like Taylorism, I think.
Yeah. I think Samuel Taylor was the one who came up with it. And so you have this scientific management in society for a long time where people believe that what science can do is it can fix things and improve things. And because we're writing this book about the coming scientific revolutions, I've been collecting anecdotes, and I think you saw me ask this question in the Discord, of what are ways in which science has been used to enact policy that has later failed. And history is riddled with examples of science having done horrific things. Eugenics, phrenology, Lysenkoism, the entire pesticide industry, the Four Pests campaign in China.
Yes, yeah, that's a great example.
Where they basically decided that they needed to get rid of all of the sparrows because the sparrows were eating the grains, and the stories of this are insane. They would chase them out of their nests, and people would gather underneath trees where they were nesting and beat pots and pans until they fell from the sky in exhaustion, and they destroyed basically the entire sparrow population in the entire country, and then the entire ecological system collapsed because they were so central to pollination.
They just got swarmed by bugs? Or?
No,
yeah, they were eating insects as well.
Yeah, they were eating, and so basically it's just like the entire thing collapsed, and history is riddled with cases where science has been used as this central rallying cry for, we have figured it out, this will be the right thing to do, we're gonna do it, and then you do it, and everything shatters, and the pieces get picked up, and we move on, and there's a new era where we're like, no. This time,
now we know.
Now we know. We didn't know before.
Right.
Now
And
we
I think
know.
people are confused because they think science is like one process, right? But there's lots of different ways to conceive of how to go about science. It's like, people are saying like, trust the science, like it's a single monolithic ideal. And like, that's as ridiculous as saying like, trust your legs. Like, whose legs? Am I like an athlete, or am I a couch potato? Like, it's not a unifying concept.
But in the hands of centralized power structures, that's when you run the risk of overcommitting to a theory before it's actually proved in practice. So Lysenkoism in the USSR is a great example of a scientist who claimed he had particular results for growing wheat and crops better by just cramming them in and forcing them to adapt. And the political elites liked the idea for cultural reasons, and then they enforced that on the farmers who were protesting, saying, no, this isn't going to work, crops are all going to die, and the crops all died and everybody starved. So, and the COVID response, I think, is a good example of a monolithic response. There was a coordination in how different nations responded to it. Why that happened, I don't claim to know, but there was a uniformity where
people got rich. I mean, I'm not saying that's why, but
that's one possible incentive. The other possibility is China had policies to respond to another SARS-1 outbreak, and they did successfully contain SARS-1 because it has very different epidemiology. So when the novel coronavirus broke out, all they had on hand were the policies for SARS-1. The lockdowns, the restrictions that just magnified in scale because that's all the system knew to do. And then all of the other countries imitated that response because they didn't have any policies on hand either. So that's another way of looking at framing the response. And if you look at how government policy is developed these days, a lot of it is centralized in the name of efficiency. And we're putting all of our eggs in one basket, assuming that that's the only way to find the best solution. Because, the more we think about it, the more we measure, the more we model, the more likely we are to get it right. And for complex systems, that isn't true. You're better off having a diversity of approaches and allowing a little bit of serendipity to creep into the response.
That sounds like the hippiest state that I've ever heard of.
I mean, God, not to mention the fact that we can engineer monsters too, right? I mean, there's like obviously a very compelling, at least discussions surrounding the origins of this virus anyways.
The like viral gain of function stuff, but in terms of engineering monsters and engineering ourselves into crisis.
Did you see this?
I wasn't even going to go there because so there's questions about because there was the Project Veritas thing. It came out last night where the guy from
I saw it.
Right,
yes.
And so now there's all these people who are like, it's weird because the guy's director of R&D at Pfizer, but he has no scientific papers published, and it's unclear if it's a honey trap of some kind. And so I'm sort of like, I'm holding off to see if anybody can effectively demonstrate that it's not accurate. But the point that I wanted to make was not about pharmaceutical giants being evil, because that's like a given. I'm concerned that we're engineering monsters by engineering fruits and vegetables without seeds.
Yes. Yeah. Well, that's a big part of my project here too, is maintaining fertility in my crops. So the source genetics for my my main staple crop. It's a plant called arrowroot. It's from northern Peru, and it gets these big starchy tubers, kind of tangentially related to bananas and gingers. So it was grown 100 years ago in the area by slave labor imported from our local islands. Thank you, because no one else could be bothered being out there in the sun growing the thing. But it was a single selected clone that had probably been grown for thousands of years in Peru, where it originated, and was propagated vegetatively. So it had nice big tubers, but it had really low vigor. And when you tried to produce seeds from it, it's accumulated so many somatic mutations over those, thousands of generations that it's almost infertile. So I found seed of the wild ancestor of this species that grows like a weed. It's got big tubers, but not quite as easy to harvest. And it grows 3 meters tall. It's incredibly vigorous, incredibly fertile.
Wow.
And it took me a couple of years to get those two strains to cross with each other. So now I have a hybrid population that has better tubers, but it also has better vigor. And most importantly, it's retained its fertility. So that original clone is an example of a society finding a good enough solution, over investing in it to the point that it becomes brittle and it can no longer respond to systemic changes.
Man, the nature of the human project in relation to fertility is something that I think about a lot, which is that our systems, because so many of our systems are foundationally biological. And what I mean by that is that in order to eat, you have to deal with biology. The entire endeavor is a process of tightly controlling fertility and controlling the things that we want from it and the things that we don't want. And I don't think that people think about how much food and sex on a biological level are tied together. Whether it's, milk from animals or eggs from chickens or seeds from plants. And you get a lemon that's seedless, and it chills me to the bone. like I understand that it's supposed to be a good thing because, seeds are gross. And which I don't know if it's because I grew up as an immigrant, but it seems to me that it's an extension of people who don't like to eat meat off the bone. Because they're like, oh, there's weird stuff in there. And I'm like, how can you distance yourself from the visceral act of what you're doing to the degree that you won't interact with the body of the animal that you're eating? How can you distance yourself from the fertility of fruits and vegetables to the degree that you want to breed the seeds out? It freaks me out because it seems reflective of something bigger, and I haven't worked out quite yet what it's reflecting, but I feel like it's some spiritual conflict that we have at the very center of ourselves.
That is the most hippie thing that has ever been said on this show, actually.
I would actually say that it relates back to the logistics of our industrial system. So a really good example of this, if you go back a few hundred years, everybody ate offal. Like the idea of eating tripe or livers or kidneys or hearts or brains, they were the prized ingredients when an animal was slaughtered. Fast forward to today, and almost nobody knows how to prepare them. And even if you prepared them well, people would reject them because the texture's strange and the flavors are strange. The reason why that came about is because organ meats are very difficult to transport over long distances, whereas muscle meat is relatively stable. And it's all got to do with railroads and shipping and refrigeration. And it wasn't driven by the desires of the customer. It was imposed on them long enough by the limitations of the industrial system until they just became accustomed to it.
Yeah, and I wonder what happens as the industrial system starts to lift, right? Because we're already starting to get into a place where the ease of transport is becoming harder and harder. It is shrinking. And so as things become more local, I think that it might return, but I also feel like the generational knowledge that's required for it has faded, right? Because to plant something in the ground and to get it to grow is hard enough. To get an animal from birth to reproduction to death is, you could look some YouTube videos up and you could probably figure it out, but it is such a high bar for it to return to the population, because even if we have post-collapse a return to regionalism, what you end up having is that some fraction of every region is going to have to turn to agriculture.
Mm.
And so there's not enough of those people.
Well, not all regions are cut out for the same.
No, they'll be
diverse
doing things. I
jobs.
mean, I think that you can probably raise animals everywhere. Like, you could probably raise chickens everywhere. You could probably, like, pasture goats almost everywhere. Like, you know, you've seen,
Yes, yeah.
right? Like, you've seen goats on the side of a godforsaken mountain, just like.
But you're not going to
licking
grow
salt off
coffee
their legs.
here in Oregon or something like that.
No, you'll
Yeah.
you'll be drinking chicory root. You'll be drinking
The
dandelion
hell I
root.
will.
I mean, I'm just saying, like these things. I think that they're
I will
inevitable.
sell my chair out from under myself first.
Yeah, I
mean-
just like every time I drink a cup of coffee, I'm like, this is not forever. Like I really like and I don't know why I feel that way. I
Living
feel
with
like-
a Russian, you know? Can you imagine?
Have you ever seen the connection between widespread caffeine consumption and scientific golden ages pointed out?
No.
So 8th century China is when people started drinking tea widely. The Islamic golden age is when coffee was popularized. And then the Renaissance in Europe was linked to importation of coffee and tea.
Oh well, we have
So-
a ephedra that grows out here, which is called Mormon tea, and so you can dry ephedra, and it has some like ephedrine precursor in it.
It's illegal now.
No, you can literally go into the woods.
But you
and-
can't buy it, though. You
No,
can't
no,
buy
no,
it.
no, no, but like you go and
very
you can
recent.
drive like half an hour from our house, and ephedra is just growing. Like when I would lead people on hikes, I would like find it along the way, and you can chew it, and you can kind of like it has a little zing to it. I think you'd probably have to have a lot of it to work. But I'm saying is that I wonder whether or not every region, every bioregion has a collection of products that will give you that collection of neurochemicals that we get from coffee
And
most
nutrients.
easily, and nutrients too. I mean, if
You're
you
going to
go
be
to
eating a lot of potatoes in Russia, right?
tons of potatoes in Russia, if you look back here, I think for the most part it was like oak forests and pine nuts and stuff like that. Like I don't think it's palatable food. Like you understand why the Industrial Agricultural Revolution happened and people were excited for it, because you have some berries here, but you're mostly going to be eating roots and acorns, and they're not. There's not really
It's hard
spices.
to imagine people. Yeah, I guess it's hard to imagine the timescales necessary to pull people out of their tastes and their wants to have fresh berries for breakfast every morning, and you know,
Do you want to hear my theory about a broader direction that agriculture could go?
hell yeah.
Yeah, let's do it.
So the earliest agriculture that's sometimes called horticulture, like I said, is tuber-based, starchy tubers, and that allows populations to survive like periods of low food quality because you've like at least got calories to keep you going, but they can't be stored easily, they can't be transported easily. So that limits the ability to build more complex societies. And they were usually limited to relatively warm, reliably wet places in the world. So about 10,000 years ago, something changed in the global climate that made grain-based civilizations possible on scale. And from my own experiences, I think they're right. It was about having reliable sequences of wet periods and then dry periods. Like they often appeared in seasonally arid regions first, and later, much later, that was adapted for seasonally cold regions. So that allows you to grow grains, which are much more energy dense. They're like 10 times more energy dense than tubers. And because they can be stored dry, they can also be transported. So that allows raiding and war to be profitable. It allows taxation to support large complicated structures. Now, in Australia, we have a very unpredictable climate. To give you context, about 6 years ago, during the other end of our El Nino cycle, we had 9 months without any rain. The first day of spring hit 40 degrees Celsius. All of our geese eggs in the nest cooked, like they can't go above like 36 degrees. There was fires everywhere. There was ash raining from the skies. There was paralysis ticks crawling across the land. It was like hell on earth. And we're just like, oh, well, it'll change again. The last summer we had 9 months of nonstop rain, the peak of which we had 1 meter of rain in 3 days. So I've developed a strain of maize, like flour maize, that's resistant to our local parrot population. I was very lucky to tap into the genetics to make that possible. But the problem with this crop is it needs to be damp at the time that I plant it and then dry when I harvest it. Otherwise, the crop can't get started in time. And when I harvest it, if it's raining too much, it just rots on the plant. So that's a reason why grain-based agriculture was never viable in Australia, because I only actually get a finished crop about 50% of the time that I go to all of the effort of planting it. It's just not worth it. So the obvious possibility is that lacking industrial inputs, Australia would go back to, at best, horticultural type tuber societies on the coasts, which support nothing more than like local villages. Like you just can't maintain cultural complexity built on that. But canna, this crop that I'm breeding, has a superpower. It's got the largest starch grains of any known plant. So when you grate up the tubers, the starch sinks to the bottom of the water, and it's really easy to purify and it's really easy to dry. So because this is a perennial crop, you can establish the stands of it during the good years, and it continues, like you can set it on fire, you can have it dry, you can have it underwater. It just carries on under our local conditions. Once you have extracted the starch out of it, it's twice as energy dense as grain, and it stores way more stably. Like grains have proteins and oils. They end up with insects and fungi inhabiting them. If we can develop the crops for starch extraction, we potentially have a foundation for a complex civilization that allows transport of food, it allows taxation, it allows collaboration on bigger scales, which allows you to achieve levels of complexity. But the foundation is resistant to fluctuations in climate, because I'm not so much worried about just warming climate. I'm worried about tipping into an unstable regime, which seems to have been the norm before 10,000 years ago. And I think in the US, you're seeing the jet stream doing things.
That's critical, just recognizing that it's going to change.
Yeah.
It's going, I mean, it always has changed.
How does it taste?
That's exactly what my question was.
It's just pure starch.
Sounds great. Is it tasty?
Starch. So it has no flavor. It's absolutely pure starch. And
so we'll need some spices.
You grow other things to incorporate in with it, but it's the energetic foundation for your population. In Southeast Asia, they grow it in the mountains where the soil is too thin for rice, and they turn it into a cellophane noodle. That's their very industrious way of using it. And there are other crops, other tuber crops like cassava, which has loads of cyanide in it in some strains, which can be processed to extract starch and create a product that you could build a different kind of society on it. It reminds me about how the change in metabolic intensity was necessary for multicellularity to become possible. Like it's very difficult to make a multicellular organism without oxygen and mitochondria, creating just a higher base metabolic rate.
How does it digest? Like, because I think that there's some starches that digest easier than others.
Yes, yeah. So like most starches, you cook it and it undergoes a gelling process, so it becomes less crystalline. And if you happen to be from a population with a higher amylase gene count, which seems to be our most interesting critical mutation in recent human evolution, then you can get most of the energy out of that product before the microbes in your gut take it for you.
If not, you're gonna be having some terrible farts.
Yeah, that's probably true.
They tend to be the resistant starches that, even when they're cooked, are difficult to digest. Canna starch is very digestible. It's often used in baby formulas, or for people who are ill and their digestive system has broken down.
And so how far are you from something that you would be able to distribute?
So at the moment, I'm sending hybrid seed to anyone in the world, because if you want to locally adapt that crop, you're better off starting with an early hybrid swarm where there's lots of diversity in the population and you can steer it in the direction that you need. So, for example, I've sent some seed to people in cold regions in the US where you would normally never try and grow this crop because it's like tropical, subtropical at best. And they're reporting that the seedlings they've grown from me have made it through the cold season without rotting. Whereas all of the other genetics that they previously tried, they have to dig them all up and put them in a warm shed. So you never know what biology is capable of until you ask it in the right way, until you nudge it through those difficult early stages and bring together lots of diversity from as far afield as you possibly can. And just see what it's capable of tolerating. And
these are the ones that you took, which you hybridized with the wild. This is arrowroot?
Yeah. The wild ancestor was crossed with that narrowly inbred sterile clone. Well, almost sterile clone.
And so, this is kind of a technical question, but how do you actually accomplish the crossing?
Oh, well, I've got an article on my blog, Zero Input Agriculture, if you want to see. The main difficulty was that the flowering wasn't synchronized, that one would flower much later than all of the others. So I went through a year of trying to store the pollen. So a lot of crops, you can dry the pollen down and keep it in a freezer, and you can use it at any time that you want. Through a year of experimenting with like germinating the pollen and then storing it in all sorts of different conditions, I determined that it was impossible. It's one of these intractable, perishable types of pollen. Banana has the same issue, which is quite closely related. And then I came up with a really simple solution. I just cut back one of the varieties halfway through its flowering season, and that caused it to start its cycle again and line up with the sterile clone. So it was a really low-tech solution. It just took intuition and playing around until you found a way.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Engineers, man, I'm telling you.
Yeah,
It's a different bag.
Whereas a modern industrial scientist would like get out the liquid nitrogen or try and transfer one gene at a time for vigor from one strain to another.
Which is it's tragic because I'm like, let those, like, that's cool. Like, from a curiosity standpoint, like, that would be totally fine by me. Like, I wish people had the energy to actually understand the molecular superstructures and try to make sense of it, but that they should justify it technologically is just...
Yeah, I fully support reductionist biology. I think it's amazing, but I just suspect it's not going to give the results that we want. And it's not going to be around for long enough to really matter in like a civilizational scale. Industrial civilization is only a few hundred years old, and it's already looking like it's getting a bit moth-eaten.
And I mean, like, and almost all of this stuff is stored digitally. And so if we have like a Carrington level event and there's a big EMF pulse, it's just so apparent that it's fragile. And so how did you learn all this stuff? Because you were doing plant biology in your postdoc, but is this just something that you've been fascinated with your whole life, or you?
So yeah, I've been growing strange plants and keeping all sorts of bizarre animals ever since I've been a kid, and that's transformed into like practical crops as I've gotten older. I've given up that kind of weird hobby, but yeah, strange succulents and carnivorous plants and all that kind of stuff that grabs a kid's attention. I was into that when I was younger, so I was a bit of an odd character in that regard. But to give you an example, like, this is a temperamental kind of personality thing. When I was in my teens, about 16, I was growing a kind of succulent plant that has fly-pollinated flowers that have this really, really complicated pollination mechanism that's almost microscopic. So with the early days of the internet, I did a little bit of research about how other people were learning how to pollinate these things. And I then spent like 2 years of my life trying and failing to come up with tools and techniques to do my own hand pollination. And it took me like a year and a half before I got my first success. So just having that kind of persistent, throw everything at the wall and see what works kind of attitude. I think that kind of scientist no longer has a place in academia, which is really sad because they're the ones that usually lead to the most unexpected advances.
Especially when it's like put towards this aim of being able to make something, and because I think that a lot of people are curious, but they don't necessarily. They like to read and they like to learn, but there's a certain disconnect between the learning and the actual physical implementation of it. And so I think
it's beaten out of us as children. Like, young children are much more content to tinker and play with things. And years of sitting in a chair and just, absorbing content and theory. By the time you finally get into a lab and have a slim opportunity to like follow your instincts and your curiosity, it's too late. It's far too late, particularly if you have to get to middle age before you have your own grant. It's decades too late.
Do you have kids?
I've got goat kids.
No, because I always wonder about this, where it's like, I think that there is a certain...
Are we playing out the fertility nightmare in real life right now?
Look, I think that there is, in addition to gene transfer, there's also meme transfer.
Yes.
And I think that meme transfer is as important of a project as gene transfer. And
Definitely.
Yes,
I think that
and I definitely see it that way. So the crops that I'm breeding, I want to share with other people. That's a form of meme. And the ideas that I'm thinking about, that's what inspired me to write my fictional series set in a purely biological future Earth, when industrial civilization's like so far in the past that no one even remembers what happened. And that idea, I think, is designed to get people thinking about the possibilities and hopefully doing some plant breeding or crop breeding or home microbiology of their own, because there's just so many possibilities there that nobody is looking into. A really good example I love to bring up is Luther Burbank. So not many people know about this guy. I saw you mention him the other day, so I must have gotten to you with that meme. So he was a self-taught plant breeder from the late 1800s in the US, and he somehow stumbled upon just crossing every possible plant that you could imagine, cross genera, all these weird crosses. And even biologists today, like botanists, you would say, oh, what happens if I cross this genus and that genus? They'd be like, oh, you're wasting your time, it'd never work. And this guy did it like over a century ago, and it worked. And he created all of these crazy hybrids, showed that you can do selective breeding in all sorts of directions that nobody was bothering to do.
Well, I think that he invented, I don't want to exaggerate, so I'm going to say 500, but the number that's in my head is 800 cultivars that are still in use today. Like
it's just ridiculous.
Did random things that, like you said, everybody was like, that's never going to work. And he actually produced tons of flowering plants. I think he might have done, across all types of plants, he came up with crazy cool things that we're still using today.
So a comparable example to this would be the experiments that are happening with mentor grafting. And this is mostly happening in Asia. So even in some of Darwin's notes, there's these reports of when you graft plants onto each other, there seems to be persistent heritable changes that happen. And we've recently figured out that, yes, what is actually happening is that exosomes are being released from one of the tissues and then being absorbed by the others. So exosomes are these membrane-bound vesicles that all cells secrete that contain proteins and hormones and also nucleic acids.
Sounds like a virus.
It pretty much is, but it's a intracellular organismic virus, and it happens in mammals as well too. So some of the people doing longevity research with like blood transfusions from young people, they think some of the results they're getting are from exosomes in the blood that are different in the young people versus the old people. But it's a form of low-tech transgenesis that anybody who can connect two plant tissues together potentially can move genetic material between them. It happens in nature through parasitic plants. So one thing I imagine in my future fiction is that we've actually bred parasitic plants that have this purpose, that allow you to connect two different plant species together without having to have blades and grafting and cellular compatibility, and allow genetic material to flow more freely between organisms. Ultimately, I see humans having the potential to being the universal symbiont on the planet, that we could coordinate the flow of genetic information between all species and open barriers in a controlled way that completely transforms the structure of evolution.
I love it.
And an analogy would be when the early flowering plants teamed up with pollinating insects. So before that time, if you wanted to do sexual reproduction, you had to blow spores all over the place. And you can only tolerate having so much diversity of spores in the air at any one time before hybridization brings populations back together. But once you can attach your pollen to a particular insect, you end up with this positive feedback loop where the insects undergo an explosion of species formation and the plants undergo a parallel explosion in species creation at the same time. And it completely transforms the function of terrestrial ecosystems. And I suspect humans have the possibility of being the equivalent of those pollinating insects, except we're moving
it's so important.
DNA itself.
It's we're so hungry for like a unifying narrative for, probably
a positive narrative.
What is the main, what are people looking for when they go to youths? People are looking for what is the meaning of life, right? People are asking scientists, what is the purpose of this? Why are we here floating around on this planet? And I think that that's a really interesting perspective that we've come across a few times, is that humans actually have a sort of catalytic role in the whole process, in this cosmic process that's transforming our own biosphere,
Well, if you
and is reaching out to other biospheres.
yeah, like if you assume that
If the,
the Earth,
hypothetical.
yeah, like if you assume that the Earth has a lifespan in terms of habitability, in terms of resources, in terms of everything else, then you have to recognize that at some point you're going to have to leave the planet. And in order for the experiment of life to survive, the fruiting of the planet is the dispersal of the seeds.
Mm-hmm.
And humans are the only ones that are on that project.
Well, the bacteria are tagging along.
The bacteria are that's true. But it's like they wouldn't really be tagging along unless they. I
They
guess
might be the last people on the field at the end of the day,
they
too.
might be. I mean, you can have a catastrophic event where the planet blows up.
But in my theory, I explore the same basic idea, which I think is like a narrative that people latch onto as old as time. But my end conclusion is that humans are the catalyst for creating the species that's capable of going into space. We are too complex. We're too slow breeding. We're too well adapted for the really, really strange conditions on Earth to be compatible with serious space existence in space. But we do have the ability to create something that is capable of living in space.
Whoa! Does your I mean, I looked over the books, the synopsis that you sent us, but do you imagine this as being a part of a series that then eventually leads to space? Because can you give
So you have the first 4 books, which are written. They're coming out soon. There's another 3 that are outlined to finish the series, and the last one ends 50 million years in the future. It kind of jumps forward and it looks at the consequences of everything that's been put into motion.
Can you, for people to get it, because we've talked about the book series multiple times, but we haven't really explained the premise of it. Do you have like a few sentences that you could wrap the ideas up in? Okay, let's hear it.
So it's set around 30,000 years in the future. And there are 2 main groups of humans on the planet. The largest continents are managed by an elite that are relatively ungenetically modified, who live on islands and have a slave race that they've engineered to be like the perfect slaves, that they actually love being slaves and they have diminished human capabilities, that they fit into that role perfectly. So they're kind of like the bad guys of the picture. There's an alternate race of people who live in a more dynamic kind of society with many, many lineages, all living in independent cells that undergo their own life cycle of being founded by a few individuals, growing up, doing genetic selection experiments, serving productive roles that fit into the bigger superorganism of all of those cells fitting together and coordinating, and then reach an endpoint where that small group of people actually, they all die to be replaced. And it was inspired by the relationship between apoptosis and multicellularity. So individual cells have to be able to sacrifice themselves for the functioning of the whole system in order to build a larger, more complex society. But to do that, that other group of humans have to overcome their individual fear of death. So for them, dying isn't a big deal because both for biological and cultural reasons, they don't expect to live long lives and have as many children as possible. And I was kind of inspired by that, by what seems to be the key, one of the key evolutions for modern humans. So modern humans seem to have reduced reactive aggression to strangers. So if you look at other species which have comparable evolutionary pathways, they can undergo a domestication syndrome where they don't automatically react with aggression to something that they don't recognize. And Neanderthals and Denisovans probably had higher reactive aggression to outgroups, which prevented them from coordinating and cooperating with each other. Modern humans seem to have self-domesticated so that adjacent tribes could share culture, they could share technology, they could share mates. And that allowed modern humans to spread rapidly across the entire surface of the Earth as a kind of superorganism, where they were all coordinating with each other on a level. So in my fiction, I imagine what would be the next stage to form a more integrated superorganism that isn't just a colony that spreads everywhere, but actually achieves a finer grained level of specialization and integration. And yeah, the
So
way
you're way
that,
more of a theorist than you give yourself credit for.
well, yeah, so that was the core idea, and the story is basically a clash between those two sides of the equation.
One thing that's really interesting, correct me if I'm wrong, but aren't they like these cells, these individual little nucleations, these cells in bioanalogy, they're like harems, right? It's like...
Often, yeah, they have different structures. I was inspired by the tribalism of Papua New Guinea, where every little mountain valley has a different group of people that arrange their society in really, really different ways. So I thought that was something interesting to play around with, that the different lineages organize their societies in different ways.
What is the project that all of the cells are coordinating?
So in the first 4 books, the main project is colonizing the entire planet and displacing that slave-based empire, which is the bigger and more formidable of the two. And hopefully it's not giving too much away, but the way they plan to do that is colonizing the oceans, which have been an ecological dead zone for like 2 billion years due to failures of mineral cycling.
I mean,
I want to see this thing, man. You gotta call up somebody listening.
When we find somebody at Netflix,
somebody will work at Netflix. Make this thing happen.
It's so ambitious, right? Like, I think that you, when we first started talking about this, you pointed out that nobody had really written this kind of biological sci-fi before, and I think that that's because it's hard to play with the ideas without quickly becoming horrified at what's possible. And so there is this thread of just, oh my God, what is happening in terms of the plot and the characters and the structures that they live in? Because usually when science fiction is written, it's humans as they are right now encountering new environments.
Yes.
It's very rare for it to be about what will humans one day be.
And that's the fundamental difference, is that this new kind of humans have no instinctive fear of their own death. And through a mixture of changes in biology and changes in culture. And it's really interesting when you actually look at recent history, the industrial population's fear of death is quite different to how pre-industrial people related to it. So just one example, like infanticide used to be extremely common in cultures all around the world. It still is in some places. And how that is dealt with culturally it's a very difficult issue, particularly from a modern mindset where throwing all the resources possible to keep every child alive as long as possible is the way we frame the purpose of our life. But yeah,
and we hide the death away too, right? That's one of the things that I noticed.
So to finish with that, you're saying that you don't have to go that far back in order to find a place where our relationship to death is totally different?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And even today, like look at, compare Western with perhaps East Asian cultures, they are much less squeamish about cultural issues around death. Even around genetic engineering, like China has, gotten ahead of the start gun, and they've already done human genetic engineering that they've admitted to with those two girls that were born that were supposed to be HIV resistant.
What were you going to say about the...
I was just going to say it's crazy, like just seeing like what happened, like when somebody dies, right? Or just look at, they throw a blanket over him, right? Immediately. Or, in an accident, if someone, we don't really have these open casket funerals the way that we used to in the past. I mean, the body was always put on display. I believe that the early construction of a lot of the homes, at least on our continent, was they built a parlor expressly with the dimensions and qualities so that you could have a casket in there. It was such a regular occurrence, essentially, that you would examine the body, and death would just kind of be part of something you would grow up with. I don't think anybody made it to the age of 18 without seeing a good stack of corpses. So
here's an interesting hot take. So the Christian society was built around the fear of hell to motivate people moment to moment. Maybe our industrial society is built around an amped up fear of the idea of death.
Certainly our cosmology is.
I And I mean, of suffering too. I think that people want to live a good life. People want to live and be able to partake in experiences. And they want to be able to, like, I kind of had this weird feeling about travel where when I was younger, it was a central part of my identity, where it was like, what I want to do, I don't want to go to college, I don't want to learn, I don't want to study, I want to travel. And my parents were understandably, as, you know, upstanding members of society, like, absolutely not. You're going to go to college. And obviously, like, that took me into a different tack, but I still found time to travel. But I realized along the way that the accumulating of experiences was hollow. When you would go to these places and you would show up and you would have this itinerary of this hotel, these restaurants, these destinations, then you would spend a few days there and then you would go to a new place. And it would be this very, very artificial set of activities that seem to still drive people forward. Like, people work really hard so that they can get access to those activities because they fulfill them. And I think you're right that that's part and parcel of the industrial machine, that people want to be able to do stuff, and so they participate in it because it buys them something that they want, that feels good, because you get to play, you get to relax, you get to step outside of your life. And I've always...
But it's interesting to reflect on how arbitrary the signals coming from that system to coordinate culture can be. It's almost like a primordial endocrine system, the way culture works in society to coordinate, you know, masses of individuals on a scale that would otherwise not be possible. I mean, social insects do it with pheromones. We do it with, like, books and songs and fashions.
Yeah, and like 10 places to go before you die lists. Like, it's definitely true.
I love the biology analogies for everything in the realm of behavior. There's so much. It's actually so much more of a productive analogy than trying to compare us to some physical structures that are doing things.
I mean, it's so nice because I do this all the time, and I have one friend in particular who I'll do this with, and I'll try to, like, bring up biological parallels, and she's like, "You can't do that." She's like, she's
like, people are not biology.
Well, not even that, but she was trained in, like, literary criticism and Marxist thinking. And so she has a very specific set of ways in which you can think about things. And she can't...
The Hegelian dialectic.
Yeah, and she can't quite bin it into, like, eugenics and phrenology, but she, like, it has those vibes, because when you start talking about people as biology as opposed to spirit and other things, then immediately it opens the door to the creepy things that scientists have done over the course of history. But it's so refreshing to be able to talk to somebody who has thought through these things and come up with a lot of things that are so resonant and seem so apparent.
Well, the other analogy I really love is, so individual people have a tendency to get a strange idea in their head or develop a strange behavior. And it's a really, really common thing. And from their perspective, it seems completely rational and it makes sense. A good example is, like, my strange addiction, people who develop a habit for eating some ostensibly non-food item. So my theory is that human societies are optimized for the right level of that kind of, for want of a better word, craziness, like divergent thinking. And it functions almost like an immune system, an adaptive immune system, where all the different B cells proliferate and mutate their antigens. And most of those are completely useless. And the B cell just sits there waiting. And no one ever pays attention to it. But
they die off. They die off.
Yeah, but 1 in 1,000, 1 in a million of them end up being useful in the real world around the organism. And that useful trait gets multiplied up so that it can actually be exploited. And I think humans are meant to function in a similar way, that we all have a tendency to get some strange idea in our head, start behaving in some odd way. And everyone around us is constantly watching us. And if they see us benefiting from that thought or behavior, they will tend to imitate it, and it spreads mimetically. So...
there's actually two processes going on there, just to clarify. So the B cells
Shiloh's immunology background is coming out.
I just want to say, like, because I see both happening actually, which is really interesting. So, like in the hypermutation phase, once there is an antigen that takes off, that's the phase that you're talking about, I think, where like some meme like picks up. But you're right. There are just, that's what's really perplexing is there, particularly. I guess would it be B cells? I think we'd probably be more looking for a T cell actually, that's just hanging out there, and I guess so. Yeah, there's probably, especially after
I can't help you. I've forgotten all my immunology.
Yeah, we have to go back. But there are clones hanging around, right? That are responsive to whatever they might encounter. Somebody's got to bring it down to the lymph node and be like, there's these dendritic cells that are part of the immune system that are out there scavenging for whatever, and they'll bring those antigens back, and some clone is going to be like, hey, that's my thing. That's my thing. Guys.
But I think that I think that that's true too. But the core of it is that it seems, Shane, like what you're saying is that there's a human tendency to become obsessed.
Mm-hmm.
And that obsession can lead you to eating paint chips as much as it can lead you to making spaceships.
Yep.
And like,
and you don't know until you commit your whole life to something. Sometimes, like, there's a lot of scientists who made like amazing breakthroughs, and they spent decades of people thinking they were completely loopy. But for every one of those who actually comes up with an amazing discovery that's useful, there's like 99 cranks that are, well, they were never proven by reality to have been doing anything useful. So there has to be room for that behavior in the ecosystem. There's an optimum amount of craziness in the system, basically. And I think modern society is, I think it's punishing that divergent thinking too much.
Well, certainly YouTube is.
in what sense?
I mean, come on. Like, you can, like, take this into whatever realm you want, but there are tolerable ideas and intolerable ideas. I'm like,
well, we're living through a dark ages right now.
Yeah, I'm like a bit of like a free speech absolutist. I just think that it's better to talk things out than to try to stick them down in some dungeon where they can fester and recruit worse ideas.
Yeah, I mean, like that kind of opens another rabbit hole of, you have what craziness do you have to put a stop to because it's mimetically infectious in a way that's not good, right? Because there's...
And technology amplifies the speed at which bad ideas can spread. But I mean, that goes right back to the printing press. Like the second bestseller of the printing press was the book about how to burn witches. And that spread a social contagion all over the place. And like people ran with it before, they kind of realized they were doing something crazy.
Right. And so I think that it's really easy to get caught in these loops where we do really crazy things because of that tendency for craziness to be infectious and for hysteria to catch and for people to get focused on things that aren't useful. And to bring it back to the sort of the things on YouTube, there was a really, maybe like 5 or 6 years ago, there was a very concerted push to clean up YouTube because every single video that was popular was basically an Ancient Aliens conspiracy video. Like you'd show up to YouTube and you'd just like look at the sidebar and you'd be watching something about, knitting. And like every single video in the sidebar was like, the Anunnaki, Planet 9 is coming to destroy the Earth. And YouTube, I remember YouTube got a lot of flack for it because it was basically just spreading this mimetic chaos. It's like
it's a hyperstimulus. Like it scratches that psychological itch to a ridiculous extent.
And I think that people also have a desire to orient themselves towards nationalistic or cultural violence. And so I'm very, very, very nervous about that because, you watch a documentary about the collapse of the Soviet Union and there's like Tajik women that are dressed Western, wearing makeup, pictures of like Tom Cruise on the wall. And she's talking about what's going to happen when the Soviet Union collapses and the nationalist forces win, which is that she's going to go into a veil and her life is over. And, I'm also Jewish. And so I have this feeling where I'm like, man, pogroms happen. You get enough people in a room who are like, get 'em. And that's it. Like, that's before you, like, there's blood in the streets. And so I'm very, very, very nervous about the way that bad ideas can be infectious because of this tendency in ourselves to attach to them.
I'm more just like, no, we'll just stand up and say why it's stupid, and that's that.
That's worked really well in the past.
Well, I'm just saying, like, you could print a book about why burning witches is stupid too, and if you had...
But it's not as popular as the book that's like, release your inner animal. Like, people want those opportunities. Like, people yearn for the opportunity to go out in a blaze of justice and to paint themselves.
So you gotta just reorient that towards, like, hunting the witch hunters.
Maybe. I'm not going to say no. I think that's difficult.
Look, here's the problem.
But hold on. Before you go into the problem.
If you start... Come on.
I think you're right, but I think it's hard the same way that Eddington managed to get Einstein's ideas accepted, and there's no one else who is as charismatic as him who could stop that. And so it's the same thing here. The person who writes the book about how to burn the witches is very charismatic, and the person who writes the book about how we shouldn't burn the witches is a ninny.
Yeah, that's what it comes down to. Who's the decider, right? Like, who's
the influencer?
Yeah.
What were you gonna say?
That's all.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's one thing I really wonder hasn't been explored is how our, for want of a better word, cultural immune system would respond to the loss of mass media. Like, if it disappeared, like if the TVs all blinked off and we were left to just talk amongst ourselves, how would we respond psychologically and culturally to that? And I think that's a really difficult thing to even imagine.
Well, it's got to be better. That's what I'm saying. Like, the alternative is somebody's a decider, and who is that, and why? What are their interests that don't align with mine as user 93684 or whatever? Like, how is it that we are willing to resign our, like, if we're going to police information, is that who's going to do that? You?
Well,
like me?
It comes back to the same dynamic between multicellularism and unicellularism. That think about a single amoeba, like how intelligent it is and how many decisions it has to make for itself, versus the typical cell in a human body. Even though the whole system of a human is more intelligent and more capable, and generally is more able to, like, organize its survival, the individual cells have had to give up their autonomy to become part of the system. The intelligence is now between the cells and not within them. And I think a similar thing happens in human societies as they grow really big and coordinated. The individual gives up their autonomy to become part of that more efficient system, because the choice is being, a barbarian outside the gate being stomped on, or a peasant inside the walls, getting a relative degree of security. But those big complex systems fall apart occasionally, in the same way that a single human organism dies and disintegrates while the amoebas swimming around it happily go along their way.
And so in order to extend the nature metaphor, so Shilo's question is basically who gets to decide what messages get amplified or what messages get heard. And I'm like, look, nature has a way of de-amplifying cascades. Like a hurricane that forms over the water hits land and decreases in strength. Our algorithms right now are set up in such a way where bad ideas, because they're so visceral, become propagated and amplified. And so if you were to turn off the television, if you were to snap off all of the, the tentacles that reach into all of our brains that are controlling what it is that we're thinking about or the ideas that are percolating, I think everything would just simmer on down. Like, I really, really, really think that the aftermath of a Carrington-level event would be this amazing opportunity for everybody to look around and be like, yo, you'd snap out of a dream or a nightmare, like however you want to look at it. Like, yeah, it would be hard. We would really need to figure out how to put society back together. But at least before we rebooted the mainframes, we would have to take a second and be like, do we want to turn that back on?
I think that's like the full wrap on this whole thesis too, is just that these stepwise transitions seem to be a thing that happens in nature much more than people have been willing to entertain. And if you read the subtext of the evolutionary biological literature right now, it's there, right? People are recognizing this. The Darwinian evolution is not this nice, easy
It's
flow.
not a flow, it's a punctuated
Environments are the same thing with geology, right? It's like environments change like that sometimes, right? It's
Not all the time. Not all the time, but
sometimes.
sometimes.
Yeah.
Sometimes. You're right. It's not an either or situation. That's actually extremely important to keep in mind. But
And my takeaway principle would be that it's important to maintain structures that allow you to change the level of complexity relatively smoothly as circumstances change. So if you overcommit in one perfect worldwide crystalline system that, you know, is perfectly efficient, but you get rid of all of the little tribes that know how to, you know, defend their borders and have some tendency for aggression and self-determination. If that mega system swamps them out of existence, you no longer have a way of going back. Likewise, if you only had like dawn redwoods living on the planet, you don't have the mosses and the algae and the really simple things that can make it through the really hard times to evolve into something complicated again in the future.
likewise, if we only entertain one possible theory for some phenomenon in nature, we're closing the gates to being able to actually get ourselves out of these entrenched positions once it becomes too late.
Well, you have to have diversity. Like, I think that's the bottom line of it, is that you cannot
Diversity
have...
of perspective.
Yeah, you
really.
cannot have a monoculture. Like, if you have a monoculture, you are almost certainly not robust. You're not anti-fragile. We talked about that at the very beginning of the conversation. That, like, you want to construct systems that, in the face of chaos, are able to come back stronger. And that's not possible when these large crystalline structures break if there's nothing growing up in the understory of the forest, so to speak.
And there's a really fine balance of the amount of diversity that you want there too, it seems like, too, right? Who was it that
It was Oded Galore. He has this unified growth theory, and he basically came up to the fact that there's like too little diversity and you stagnate, too much diversity and you never get stability. And so you have to have this kind of like sweet spot of things are okay.
That's what biology is all about. It's about trade-offs and optimization, but you can also over-optimize optimization in some dimensions.
Yeah, for sure. Man, this has been a fascinating conversation. I think that we've covered like the entire universe.
I haven't touched on astronomy, so that's outside of my area of expertise.
The whole biological universe.
Yeah. Cool, man. Well, yeah, where can, I know you mentioned it once, but maybe where can folks find you? Are you on social media, or I know you have a blog if you want to.
I know you hang out in our Discord.
You hang out in our Discord. Everybody get over to
love
Discord.
Your Discord. Yes, love the Discord. That's such a fun thing to participate in. So for the fiction, that's the main thing I'm kind of spruiking today, because those books are coming out in April, all going well. So I published under the pen name Haldane B. Doyle. So you can find my author website at haldanebdoyle.com and sign up to my email list, and you'll get a monthly email with updates leading to the releases. And each of those has a little illustrated tidbit of weird biology, the kind of thing that David Attenborough never told you about because it's too hard to get footage of, is probably the main reason. So yeah, if you like weird biology, then that's kind of an incentive to sign up. And yes, it's 4 novellas that will be under the series name Our Vitreous Womb. So purely biological science fiction, which I think is something a little bit new. So hopefully I've done a decent job there, weaving in all of the drama to make the stories interesting, as well as the ideas behind the world building. And if you want to look at my non-fiction work, my experimental farming, I regularly blog at zeroinputagriculture.com, and you can contact me through either of those platforms.
Awesome.
Fantastic. It
Guys,
has been...
Go check this out.
Yeah.
Get in deeper. Some really cool ideas, and I really hope Hollywood is listening. They're probably not, but never know.
We'll carry it with us.
I really would look forward to seeing this stuff. I'm a film person.
There's loads of sex and death in the story. Avoid it.
No, it's fantastic.
God, as if we needed more of those.
Yeah.
But yeah, okay, man. Well, thank you so much. It's been really fun to talk to you.
It has been.
Thank you
so
for
much.
the opportunity. It's just been amazing.
All right, have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, we'll see you soon.
Bye.